What if I told you that some of the most profound breakthroughs in human history aren't waiting to be discovered in the future? They're already lost somewhere in the past. Think about it. Entire civilizations once flourished with ideas and technologies so advanced, so beautifully strange, that we're only just beginning to grasp what they might have achieved. Picture vast libraries filled with scrolls that mapped the stars with impossible precision, or cultures that understood the natural world in ways modern science is still catching up to. These weren't just curiosities, they were entire systems of knowledge, frameworks for living, healing, building, and understanding the cosmos. And then, in what feels like the blink of an eye, they vanished, burned, buried, or simply forgotten. This is the story of civilization told through its abandoned knowledge systems. It's a journey into the heart of human ingenuity and its fragile relationship with time. From the legendary Library of Alexandria, where the brightest minds of the ancient world gathered, to the sophisticated astronomical devices of the Greeks and the sustainable ecological wisdom of indigenous peoples, countless ideas that once pushed humanity forward have slipped through the cracks of history. Some were lost to fire and conquest, others faded away as cultures shifted, languages died, or new ways of thinking took hold. But what if these forgotten systems still have something vital to teach us? What if the solutions to some of today's biggest challenges, climate change, energy scarcity, even social division, are hidden in the overlooked wisdom of those who came before us? That's exactly what we're going to explore together. In this video, we'll traverse continents and centuries, unearthing the hidden legacies of abandoned knowledge and meeting the brilliant minds who dared to imagine differently. We'll see how the loss of these systems didn't just erase history, it altered the very trajectory of human progress. And perhaps most importantly, we'll ask what it might mean for us today if we choose to listen, to learn from the past rather than repeat its losses. So settle in, open your curiosity, and let's begin this adventure into the great unknown, the missing pieces of our shared human story. Long before the age of printing presses and digital clouds, humanity's first experiments with preserving knowledge were as fragile as they were revolutionary. Picture the vast oral traditions of indigenous cultures, where complex histories, genealogies, and understanding of the natural world were not written down but memorized and performed, passed from one generation to the next through stories and songs. This was a living library, dynamic and deeply integrated with the land, but it was also incredibly vulnerable. A single disaster, a period of cultural disruption, or the passing of elders without apprentices could erase entire worldviews in a heartbeat. At the same time, in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, another system was being born, one that would leave a more permanent yet still fragile mark: writing. Scribes began pressing reed styluses into wet clay tablets, creating the wedge-shaped script known as cuneiform. These weren't just simple lists. They contained law codes like that of Hammurabi, epic poetry, advanced mathematical calculations, and meticulous astronomical observations. Similarly, along the Nile, Egyptian priests developed hieroglyphics, a beautiful and complex system that adorned temple walls and papyrus scrolls, encoding religious texts, medical knowledge, and administrative records. These early writing systems were monumental achievements, effectively creating the first external hard drives for human thought. But what's truly striking is how much of this recorded knowledge has simply vanished. Historian Irene Vallejo beautifully articulates that these systems were far more than mere repositories of facts. They were entire frameworks for understanding the universe, a kind of operating system for civilization itself. Their loss, therefore, isn't just about missing data. It's about the collapse of a way of seeing the world, We can see this tragic vulnerability in dramatic events like the volcanic eruption that buried the Minoan civilization on Thera. In an instant, entire libraries of linear tablets, along with the unique culture they represented, were sealed under meters of ash, their secrets permanently encrypted and lost to time. Human conflict has been an equally efficient agent of destruction. The burning of the Library of Alexandria is the most famous example, a symbol of the catastrophic price of war, but it was hardly an isolated incident. Countless archives and repositories have been deliberately targeted throughout history, wiped out to conquer not just a people, but their memory and identity. The ripple effects of these losses are almost impossible to calculate. Think of the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known works of literature. What we have today is a fragmented masterpiece, pieced together from broken tablets found across various archaeological sites. Large sections of the narrative are missing, leaving us with tantalizing gaps in the story of this ancient hero. This single epic is just a symbol for a much larger void. How many other poems, philosophies, or scientific treatises have been completely lost? What medical remedies known to the Sumerians or the Egyptians could have saved countless lives had their knowledge survived uninterrupted? What astronomical insights, which might have charted comets or understood planetary motions, faded away before they could be passed on? The decline of these early scripts themselves, like cuneiform and hieroglyphics, meant that the key to unlocking this knowledge was also lost for centuries. For generations, these records sat silently in the earth, utterly incomprehensible, their messages dormant until the painstaking work of modern decipherment began. This forces us to ask a haunting question: what other foundational ideas, what other ways of being and understanding have we lost from these ancient epochs? The dawn of recorded knowledge was a flickering candle in a vast darkness, and so much of its light was extinguished before it could be passed on. No institution represents the tragic fragility of knowledge more powerfully than the Library of Alexandria, a name that has echoed through the centuries as a symbol of both human achievement and catastrophic loss. We often picture it as a single, magnificent building, a vast repository containing every scroll in the known world, all of which were tragically lost in one great fire. But the reality, as historians like Luciano Canfora have helped us understand, is far more complex and in many ways even more fascinating. The library was not just a building, it was an idea. It was part of a larger research institution called the Mauseon, or the Temple of the Muses, which functioned much like a modern university. The Ptolemaic kings who founded it didn't just want to collect scrolls, they wanted to collect minds. They offered scholarships, free room and board, and a stimulating environment for the greatest thinkers of the age to live, work, and debate. This community of scholars was the true heart of Alexandria's genius. It was here that Euclid systematized geometry, that Herophilus pioneered human dissection, and identified the brain as the seat of intelligence, and that Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy, all because they had access to a critical mass of accumulated knowledge and the freedom to question it. The scale of their collection was undoubtedly monumental, though ancient accounts of holding 500,000 scrolls might be an exaggeration. This was a time before the printing press, so every single text was a handwritten copy. The library employed a small army of scribes whose job was not only to copy existing works but also to translate them. They actively sought out texts from every corner of the world, from Indian Vedas to Persian astronomical charts, and most importantly, the entire corpus of Greek learning. Ships arriving in the bustling port of Alexandria were reportedly searched not for contraband, but for books. Any found were taken to the library to be copied, with the copies sometimes, though not always, returned to the owners. This aggressive acquisition strategy built an unparalleled collection of diverse thought. But this leads us to the great mystery: how was it lost? The popular myth points to a single, devastating fire during Julius Caesar's civil war in 48 BCE, when he was besieged in Alexandria and his forces set fire to the docks, which may have spread to warehouses containing scrolls. While this event likely did cause significant damage, it was far from the death knell. The library's decline was a slow, agonizing process of neglect and repeated attacks over centuries. Subsequent Roman emperors were often indifferent, and funding dried up. Then came a series of religious purges, first by Christian authorities in the 4th century targeting pagan texts, and later by Muslim conquerors in the 7th century. Each event chipped away at the institution until, by the time the final remnants were gone, no one could even point to where the great library had once stood. The true cost of this loss is measured not in burned papyrus, but in the staggering intellectual delay it may have imposed on the world. Consider the case of Aristarchus of Samos, an astronomer who worked in Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE. He proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, arguing that the Earth and other planets revolved around the Sun. His treatise on this subject was almost certainly housed in the library. But without the library's platform to preserve, copy, and disseminate his radical idea, it faded into obscurity. It would take Western science another 1800 years to arrive at the same conclusion with Copernicus, a delay that is almost unimaginable. How many other revolutionary ideas suffered the same fate? How many medical breakthroughs, mathematical theorems, or philosophical insights were reduced to ashes and forgotten? The story of Alexandria is the ultimate cautionary tale about the vulnerability of centralized knowledge. It teaches us that storing the world's wisdom in one place, no matter how magnificent, makes it a single point of failure. It reminds us that preservation requires more than just a building. It requires a continuous, conscious, and distributed effort to copy, share, and protect our collective understanding across generations and geographies. The fire that consumed parts of the library was a physical tragedy, but the real failure was the extinguishing of that flame of curiosity and the breaking of that chain of transmission. While the embers of Alexandria cooled and Europe entered what was once dismissively called the Dark Ages, a brilliant new beacon of knowledge was being kindled far to the east. This was the medieval Islamic Golden Age, a period of breathtaking intellectual ferment that stretched from the 8th to the 14th centuries, centered in vibrant metropolises like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo. Here, in an atmosphere of remarkable cultural and religious tolerance, scholars from diverse backgrounds were not just preserving the ancient knowledge of the Greeks, Persians, and Indians. They were radically expanding upon it, laying the very foundations for fields we now call algebra, optics, and modern medicine. This era stands as a powerful testament to what human civilization can achieve when curiosity is funded, supported, and set free from dogma. Yet, so much of this groundbreaking work was subsequently abandoned, neglected, or simply forgotten in the West, creating a profound rupture in the story of human progress that took centuries to mend. At the heart of this intellectual revolution was the Beit al-Hikmah, or the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. Established by the Abbasid caliphs, it was far more than a library. It was a dynamic research institute and translation center that actively sought out knowledge from every corner of the known world. Caliphs sponsored teams of scholars, Muslims, Christians, Jews, and Sabians to translate the entire corpus of Greek science and philosophy, including the works of Plato, Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy, into Arabic. This was not a simple act of preservation. It was the starting point for critical commentary, vigorous debate, and most importantly, innovation. By synthesizing Greek logic with Indian mathematics and Persian observational astronomy, these scholars created a Chinese letter, more robust framework for scientific inquiry. They institutionalized the concept of peer review and insisted on empirical evidence, establishing a methodology that would much later become the bedrock of the European scientific revolution. The House of Wisdom became the nexus of a global knowledge network, a place where a problem in algebra posed in Baghdad could be discussed by a mathematician in Cordoba and solved by an astronomer in Cairo. The individuals who emerged from this environment were giants whose contributions fundamentally shaped the modern world. Consider the Persian scholar Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. In the 9th century, he wrote a seminal text whose title, Al-Kitab al-Muqtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala, gave us the word algebra, but his influence extends even further. His systematic approach to solving linear and quadratic equations introduced a logical, step-by-step process for calculation. Latin translations of his work later introduced these concepts to Europe, and his name, rendered as algorithmy, is the root of our modern term algorithm. His work, in essence, provided the foundational language for logical problem solving that would, centuries later, enable the creation of computer science. Then there was Abu Ali al-Hasan ibn al-Haytham, a pioneering physicist who revolutionized our understanding of vision and light. He dismantled the ancient Greek theory that sight worked by rays emanating from the eye, instead correctly proposing that light enters the eye, being reflected from objects. Through meticulous experimentation in his darkened camera obscura, he established the principles of optics and a scientific method based on reproducible testing and skepticism of authority that would not be widely embraced in Europe for another 500 years. In the field of medicine, the Persian polymath Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, produced a staggering body of work. His monumental Canon of Medicine was a 5-volume encyclopedia that synthesized all known medical knowledge from Greek, Roman, and Islamic sources, but it was far more than a compilation. It introduced groundbreaking ideas on contagious diseases, quarantine, clinical trials, and the importance of diet and psychology in health. For 6 centuries, the Canon was the standard medical textbook not only in the Islamic world but also throughout Europe, serving as the core curriculum at universities like Montpellier and Leuven well into the 17th century. Surgeons like al-Zahrawi in Islamic Spain compiled 30-volume sets of surgical diagrams and instruments, many of which he invented himself, that remained the most detailed anatomical references for half a millennium. Their detailed illustrations and descriptions of procedures, from cataract surgery to setting broken bones, were unparalleled in their precision and clarity. So, what happened? How did such a powerful and advanced knowledge system eventually fracture and fade from prominence in the West? The decline was not due to a lack of ideas, but a collapse of the stable environment that nurtured them. The single most catastrophic event was the Mongol siege of Baghdad in 1258. The invading armies sacked the city, and countless books from the House of Wisdom were thrown into the Tigris River, said to have turned its waters black with ink. This was a blow from which the intellectual heart of the Abbasid Caliphate never recovered. Political fragmentation followed across the Islamic world as competing dynasties rose and fell, often withdrawing patronage from scientific pursuits and turning inward. Furthermore, a gradual cultural and theological shift began to prioritize religious orthodoxy over the kind of free-wheeling philosophical inquiry that had characterized the Golden Age. As this was happening, Europe was slowly emerging from its feudal period, and when it began to rediscover this advanced knowledge through translations in places like Toledo, Spain, it often severed it from its origins. The works of Ibn Sina and Al-Khwarizmi were absorbed and built upon, but their identities were Latinized and their Islamic context was gradually stripped away, allowing this vast body of work to fall into a strange obscurity in the Western mind. This historical amnesia forces us to ask a deeply reflective question. The Renaissance and the scientific revolution in Europe did not emerge from a vacuum. They were built directly on the translated works of these Islamic Golden Age scholars. But what if that chain of transmission had never been broken? What if the thriving, interconnected scientific communities of Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba had continued to flourish and evolve without interruption for another 500 years? How much further might we be today in medicine, astronomy, or mathematics if that relentless engine of innovation had never sputtered? The story of the Islamic Golden Age is not merely a historical footnote. It is a powerful lesson on the essential ingredients for innovation: stable funding, cultural openness, and a society that values questioning and reason. Its abandonment reminds us that progress is not inevitable and that the flame of knowledge, no matter how bright, must be constantly and carefully tended, lest it be extinguished by the winds of conflict and change. For centuries, a profound and deeply sophisticated understanding of the natural world flourished across the globe, not in laboratories or universities, but in the lived experiences and cultural practices of indigenous peoples. This was a form of knowledge radically different from the one that would later arrive on ships from Europe. It wasn't a system of extraction and control, but one of relationship and reciprocity. Where modern science often seeks to isolate variables and conquer nature, indigenous ecological wisdom saw humanity as an integral thread in the web of life, with a responsibility to maintain its balance. This holistic knowledge system, refined over millennia of careful observation and intergenerational teaching, offered sustainable blueprints for living on this planet. Tragically, the era of colonization did not just claim lands and lives. It actively targeted and dismantled these sophisticated knowledge systems, dismissing them as primitive superstition. The consequences of this intellectual and cultural erasure are written across the degraded landscapes we are now struggling to heal. To understand the depth of what was lost, we can look to the Amazon rainforest. For generations, Western explorers and scientists viewed it as a pristine wilderness, a virgin ecosystem untouched by human hands. But emerging archaeological and ecological research reveals a far different story. It appears that what we call the Amazon is, in many ways, a vast, cultivated garden. Indigenous tribes like the Kayapo in Brazil managed the forest with an astonishing level of precision. They practiced agroforestry, selectively planting and nurturing beneficial tree species while creating fertile patches of soil known as terra preta, dark, nutrient-rich earth engineered from charcoal, pottery shards, and organic waste. This man-made soil remains incredibly fertile for centuries, a stark contrast to the nutrient-poor soils typical of the rainforest. They understood the complex relationships between species, using certain plants to attract game animals and others to repel pests, effectively cultivating the forest's biodiversity rather than simply harvesting from it. This was not a passive existence. It was active, intelligent stewardship that enhanced the ecosystem's richness and resilience. The loss of this management following displacement and cultural disruption has directly contributed to the forest's increased vulnerability to fires and desertification today. On a different continent, a similar story of sophisticated land management was playing out. Across North America, many Native American tribes practiced controlled or cultural burning. European settlers witnessed these fires and saw only chaos and destruction, a sign of a people who did not know how to properly manage the land. In reality, nothing could have been further from the truth. These purposeful, low-intensity fires were a masterclass in ecological engineering. They cleared out underbrush, reducing the fuel load that leads to catastrophic wildfires, a crisis we are now facing with increasing frequency and severity. The burns recycled nutrients back into the soil, encouraging the growth of new, tender grasses that attracted grazing animals like deer and bison, making hunting more predictable and sustainable. They also promoted the growth of specific plant species important for food, medicine, and basket weaving. The practice was so effective that it created and maintained the vast, park-like oak savannas and open grasslands that early explorers described. When colonial policies suppressed this ancient practice, the landscapes changed dramatically. Dense, fire-intolerant forests grew in, biodiversity declined, and the stage was set for the uncontrollable megafires that now dominate headlines each year. This deep, integrated knowledge is perhaps best exemplified by the agricultural practice known as the Three Sisters. For the Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, and many other Native American nations, corn, beans, and squash were not just crops, they were sacred siblings who thrived best when planted together. The genius of this system is its perfect symbiosis. The corn stalk provides a natural trellis for the bean vine to climb. The beans, in return, are nitrogen-fixing plants, taking nitrogen from the air and converting it into a form that fertilizes the soil for the nutrient-hungry corn. The broad leaves of the squash plant spread out around the base, creating a living mulch that shades the soil, conserves moisture, and suppresses weeds. Together, this trio creates a self-sustaining ecosystem that requires no artificial fertilizers or pesticides, produces a nutritionally complete diet of carbohydrates, protein, and vitamins, and protects the soil from erosion. It is a flawless model of polyculture that stands in stark contrast to the monoculture farming that dominates modern agriculture, which is heavily dependent on chemical inputs and is a major contributor to soil depletion and water pollution. Botanist and author Robin Wall Kimmerer, a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation, articulates the power of this worldview with beautiful clarity. She explains that indigenous knowledge does not separate science from spirituality or humanity from nature. In her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, she writes, "In the indigenous view, the natural world is not a resource to be exploited, but a relative to be respected. And that relationship comes with reciprocal responsibility. This philosophy of reciprocity, the idea that for every gift taken, something must be given in return, was embedded in every aspect of these knowledge systems. It was a pragmatic spirituality that ensured long-term survival and harmony. Colonization's great failure was its inability to recognize the profound science and wisdom in this approach, simply because it was communicated through story, ceremony, and practice rather than through empirical data journals. The dismissal of this knowledge was not merely an academic loss. It was a severing of a vital relationship between people and place, leading directly to the environmental crises we now face. This forces us to confront a humbling and essential question. As we now look for solutions to climate change, mass extinction, and soil degradation, how many answers are already waiting for us in these abandoned traditions? What other eco-friendly solutions, from water management techniques in the deserts of Australia to regenerative fishing practices in the Pacific Islands, are sitting in the cultural memories of indigenous communities, waiting to be respectfully heard and partnered with? The rediscovery of this wisdom is not about romanticizing the past. It is about urgently seeking a more sustainable future. It offers a different path forward, one that values balance over domination, reciprocity over extraction, and long-term resilience over short-term gain. The story of indigenous ecological knowledge is a powerful reminder that the most advanced technology for saving our planet might not be a new invention, but the very old and profound understanding of how to live within the intricate web of life, not as its masters, but as its grateful and responsible kin. Yet, as we've seen, the path of human knowledge is rarely a straight line. Just as the light of the Islamic Golden Age was dimmed by invasion and upheaval, another vast and intricate system of understanding would soon face a different kind of threat, not from swords and sieges, but from a fundamental shift in how we decided what constitutes real knowledge. This brings us to the enigmatic and deeply misunderstood world of alchemy. For too long, alchemy has been relegated to the dusty shelves of history as a pseudoscience, a foolish quest by gullible mystics trying to turn lead into gold. But this caricature is a profound injustice, one that obscures its true role as a vital precursor to modern chemistry and a holistic framework that wove together the material and the spiritual into a single, grand pursuit of wisdom. To truly appreciate alchemy, we must first step into the laboratory of an 8th century Persian sage named Jabir ibn Hayyan. In the vibrant intellectual atmosphere of the Islamic Golden Age, Jabir was a revolutionary figure. He wasn't just a theorist, he was a relentless experimenter. He designed and perfected most of the basic laboratory equipment that would be used for centuries to come. The alembic for distillation, the retort for heating substances, and countless vessels for mixing and reacting materials. His meticulous writings detail processes we now recognize as fundamental chemical operations: crystallization, filtration, sublimation, and the creation of acids like nitric and hydrochloric. He advocated for a rigorous, systematic approach to experimentation, insisting that each procedure be repeatable and its results carefully documented. This was the very bedrock of the empirical method, but for Jabir and the alchemical tradition he helped found, these physical processes were never just about manipulating matter. They were a form of divine dialogue. Every reaction, every transformation observed in the crucible was seen as an outward manifestation of an inward spiritual process. The purification of a metal mirrored the purification of the soul. This seamless integration of the practical and the philosophical is what made alchemy such a complete and ultimately vulnerable knowledge system. At the heart of this pursuit lay the most famous symbol of alchemy, the quest for the philosopher's stone. Popular culture has reduced this to a simple MacGuffin, a magical red powder that could transmute base metals into gold. But for the practicing alchemist, this was a profound misunderstanding. The stone was never just a physical substance. It was a symbol of perfection, enlightenment, and the ultimate unity of all matter and spirit. The long and arduous process of creating it, described in cryptic, allegorical texts filled with images of dying kings, mating dragons, and the rebis or hermaphroditic being, was a spiritual roadmap. It was a guide to inner transformation, using the language of chemical substances and reactions to describe a path toward achieving a state of spiritual purity and wisdom. The physical act of attempting to create the stone was in essence a years-long meditative practice, a discipline that required immense patience, self-reflection, and a deep belief in the interconnectedness of the cosmos. To dismiss this as mere superstition is to ignore the rich, symbolic language and psychological depth that these practitioners brought to their work. For centuries, this blended approach was the cutting edge of science. It was studied by some of the greatest minds in history, from the medieval scholar Albertus Magnus to the Renaissance genius Isaac Newton. Newton, whom we revere for his laws of motion and gravity, actually spent more time and wrote vastly more pages on alchemical research than on what we now call physics. He saw no contradiction between his pursuit of universal mathematical laws and his painstaking attempts to decode alchemical manuscripts and replicate their experiments. For him, it was all part of a single, grand endeavor to understand the hidden forces and active principles that animated God's creation. This all-encompassing worldview, where the spiritual and the material were two sides of the same coin, was alchemy's greatest strength and the very reason it was eventually abandoned. The rise of the scientific revolution in the 17th and 18th centuries brought with it a new philosophy championed by thinkers like René Descartes and Francis Bacon. They proposed a radical separation of mind and matter, a doctrine that would come to be known as the Cartesian split. The natural world was to be studied as a mechanical system, a great clockwork that could be understood by breaking it down into its constituent parts and measuring them. The subjective, the spiritual, and the symbolic had no place in this new, objective science. This new methodology was incredibly powerful and led to rapid, explosive advancements. But it also demanded a purge. To establish its credibility, the new science had to sharply distinguish itself from what came before. Alchemy, with its mystical language and spiritual aspirations, was an easy target. It was deliberately marginalized, mocked, and pushed to the fringes, its valuable empirical data dismissed along with its philosophical framework. As historian and practicing chemist Lawrence Principe has brilliantly argued, this dismissal came at a cost. By writing alchemy out of the history of science, we created a sanitized but inaccurate origin story for chemistry. We lost the context for how early laboratory techniques were developed and why. More importantly, we narrowed our entire mode of scientific inquiry. The alchemist's holistic view that the experimenter's own state of mind could be a factor, that purpose and meaning were woven into the fabric of nature, was completely excised. Science became a discipline focused solely on the how, while questions of why and what for were handed over to religion and philosophy. This divorce undoubtedly enabled incredible technological progress, but it also left us with a fragmented understanding of the world and our place in it. This historical abandonment forces a provocative question, one that is becoming increasingly relevant today. As modern science grapples with the complex, interconnected challenges of quantum physics, consciousness, and environmental systems, could it benefit from reintegrating some of alchemy's discarded perspectives? The alchemical worldview, which saw humanity as a participant in a living, evolving cosmos rather than a detached observer of a dead machine, feels strangely resonant in our current age. The quest for the philosopher's stone was at its core a search for a unifying principle, a theory of everything that could bridge the gap between the physical and the metaphysical. In our own way, with our Large Hadron Colliders and theories of dark energy, we are still on that same quest. The story of alchemy's fall from grace is a powerful lesson in how cultural shifts can redefine entire categories of knowledge, elevating one way of seeing the world while condemning another to obscurity. It challenges us to look back at our intellectual ancestors not with condescension, but with humility, recognizing that their abandoned path might still hold valuable signposts for our journey forward. But if the alchemists sought to transform the world from within their laboratories, another group of ancient intellectuals was performing a different kind of magic entirely, one that required looking far beyond our world to the heavens themselves. Scattered across the globe are the silent, stone testimonies of these master astronomers, monumental structures whose precise alignments with the sun, moon, and stars reveal a forgotten celestial knowledge so advanced it continues to baffle and inspire us today. These aren't just random piles of rock. They are nothing less than ancient observatories, stone calendars, and cosmic computers, encoding a sophisticated understanding of the cosmos that was painstakingly developed over generations and then, for reasons lost to time, largely abandoned. Consider the iconic circle of standing stones on Salisbury Plain in England. For centuries, Stonehenge was dismissed as a primitive Druid temple or a monument to forgotten kings. It wasn't until the 1960s that an astronomer named Gerald Hawkins applied a then-new tool, the computer, to the puzzle. His analysis revealed something astonishing. The arrangement of the massive sarsen stones and smaller blue stones wasn't arbitrary. They functioned as a sophisticated astronomical calculator. The heel stone, for instance, is positioned so that on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, the rising sun appears to crown its tip when viewed from the center of the circle. Other alignments pinpoint the winter solstice sunset and the extreme rising and setting points of the moon during its major standstill, an 18.6-year cycle. This was no crude sun-worshipping altar. It was a precision-engineered machine for predicting celestial events, allowing its builders to track the passing seasons with remarkable accuracy. This knowledge was utterly essential for an agrarian society, dictating the optimal times for planting and harvest, governing the rhythm of life itself. Yet the underlying mathematics, the precise surveying techniques, and the cultural context that gave this calendar its full meaning have been almost entirely erased by time, leaving us with a magnificent shell whose inner workings we can only partially decode. This pattern of celestial architecture repeats itself across continents and cultures, suggesting a universal human drive to map the heavens. The Great Pyramid of Giza, a marvel of engineering precision, is famously aligned to the 4 cardinal directions with an error margin of less than 1/15 of a single degree. How the ancient Egyptians achieved such accuracy without modern tools like the magnetic compass remains a subject of intense debate. Some researchers propose they used the rotation of the stars around the celestial pole, a method requiring patient, all-night observations over many years. The pyramid's descending passages are also aligned with specific stars like Alpha Draconis, which would have been the pole star at the time of its construction, serving as a perpetual celestial marker for the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife. Far across the Atlantic, the Maya of Mesoamerica built their temples with similar celestial intent. The Pyramid of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza is a masterpiece of astronomical theater. During the spring and autumn equinoxes, the interplay of sunlight and shadow creates the illusion of a giant serpent slithering down the northern staircase, a manifestation of the feathered serpent god, connecting the earth to the cosmos in a dramatic public spectacle. The Maya's entire cosmological view was interwoven with these precise observations, forming a complex calendar system that could accurately predict solar eclipses and the movements of Venus over cycles spanning centuries. Perhaps the most humbling evidence of this lost astronomical prowess comes from a site that predates them all, lying in the harsh desert of what is now southern Egypt. At Nabta Playa, a stone's throw from the Sudanese border, lies a circle of megaliths that is over 1,000 years older than Stonehenge. This remote site, built by a cattle-herding people during a period when the Sahara was a green savanna, is considered the world's oldest known astronomical calendar. The carefully placed stones align with the summer solstice sunrise and the zenith star, Sirius, whose heliacal rising, its first appearance before dawn, signaled the coming of the annual monsoon rains crucial for survival in that ancient landscape. The sophistication of Nabta Playa forces a complete re-evaluation of the timeline of scientific discovery. It proves that complex astronomical knowledge was being developed not by grand empires, but by nomadic pastoralists, long before the rise of the great civilizations we traditionally credit with such advances. So why was this profound and practical knowledge eventually forgotten? The decline was likely not a single event but a slow fading, a casualty of shifting priorities and changing worlds. For cultures like the Maya, extreme environmental changes like prolonged drought may have led to societal collapse, dispersing populations and shattering the priestly class who were the keepers of this precise celestial law. In other cases, cultural and religious revolutions may have supplanted the old ways. As empires rose and fell, new systems of power often promoted new gods and new calendars, deliberately overwriting the complex astronomical traditions of their predecessors to consolidate control and mark a break with the past. The practical need for such precise stone calendars also diminished with the invention of more portable timekeeping methods, like written almanacs and mechanical devices. The knowledge itself became a victim of its own success, once integrated into the fabric of society and then encoded in myth and ritual. The original, hard-won scientific principles behind the alignments may have gradually become obscure, even to the descendants of the builders. The loss of this celestial science leaves a profound gap in our understanding of human ingenuity. We can measure the alignments with laser precision, but we cannot fully recover the worldview that gave them meaning. Were these structures part of a global, interconnected network of knowledge, or did cultures independently arrive at the same brilliant conclusions? What other cycles, perhaps longer, more subtle planetary motions, did they track that we have yet to discern? The silent stones of Stonehenge, Giza, and Nabta Playa stand as a permanent challenge to our modern arrogance, a reminder that the drive to understand the universe is ancient, and that our current scientific paradigm is just one chapter in a much longer story. They invite us to look up at the night sky with the same wonder and intellectual curiosity as those ancient astronomers did, and to ponder what magnificent truths they perceived that we, in all our technological sophistication, are still struggling to see. While the silent stones of ancient observatories stand as monuments to a lost understanding of the cosmos, another kind of mystery sits quietly in a library vault at Yale University, a puzzle made not of rock but of vellum and ink. This is the Voynich Manuscript, perhaps the most stubbornly enigmatic book in the world. Since its rediscovery by a Polish book dealer named Wilfred Voynich in 1912, this 240-page codex has resisted every single attempt to crack its code. It's written in an entirely unknown script, a flowing hand of strange characters that don't match any known alphabet, and it's filled from margin to margin with bizarre, captivating illustrations that are just as perplexing as the text itself. There are pages upon pages of unknown plants, their roots and leaves drawn with botanical precision but representing species that no modern botanist can identify. There are intricate astrological diagrams featuring naked women bathing in interconnected, green-tinted tubes and pods that look strangely organic. There are circular charts of the stars that don't correspond to any recognized celestial map, and pages filled with tiny, repeated drawings of what appear to be cellular structures or microscopic organisms, centuries before the invention of the microscope. The manuscript feels like a glimpse into a completely alien system of knowledge, a window into a world where the rules of science, nature, and language were fundamentally different from our own. It is a ghost of a forgotten intellectual tradition, and its continued silence is a haunting reminder of how thoroughly a knowledge system can be abandoned. Theories about its origin are as varied as they are contentious, each one a reflection of what we want the manuscript to be. The most straightforward, and for some, the most disappointing theory, is that it is an elaborate and successful hoax. Proponents of this idea often point to Edward Kelly, a known 16th-century charlatan and alchemist who worked with the scholar John Dee. The theory suggests Kelly could have created the book to swindle a wealthy patron, like the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, who was famously obsessed with the occult and the exotic. A skilled forger could have invented a convincing but meaningless script and filled the pages with fanciful, unidentifiable plants to create an aura of ancient, esoteric wisdom. The fact that the vellum has been carbon dated to the early 15th century doesn't entirely rule this out. A clever hoaxer could have used old, blank parchment. Yet, this theory struggles to explain the undeniable internal consistency of the manuscript. Statistical analysis of the text reveals complex linguistic patterns, such as Zipf's law, which describes how frequently words are used in natural human languages. The Voynich text follows this pattern, something that would be incredibly difficult for a lone forger to accomplish without the aid of a computer. This suggests the text isn't random gibberish, but a constructed language or a genuinely encoded message with its own internal rules and grammar. This leads to the other compelling possibility, that the Voynich manuscript is a genuine, albeit unique, repository of lost knowledge. The most popular theory is that it is a pharmacopoeia or herbal compendium, documenting plants from a remote part of the world that were unknown to European science. Perhaps it was written by a lone, idiosyncratic scholar attempting to record his own private discoveries or synthesize several different traditions. Others see the distinct style of the drawings and propose it could be a work from the Aztec or Mixtec cultures of Mesoamerica, transcribed by a Spanish missionary into a phonetic script for a native language that has since been lost. The biological sections, with their bulbous, pod-like shapes, have even led to speculations that it contains forgotten alchemical or proto-microbiological knowledge, a visual representation of processes that we can no longer comprehend. Each theory is a key that seems to almost fit the lock, but ultimately fails to turn it. World War II codebreakers who cracked the infamous Enigma machine, modern cryptographers from the NSA, and sophisticated artificial intelligence algorithms have all taken their turn at deciphering the text. They have thrown the full force of 20th and 21st century computational power at this 15th century puzzle, and all have retreated baffled. The manuscript has humbled the best minds in cryptography, proving that some locks are designed with keys we no longer possess. This profound resistance to decipherment is what makes the Voynich manuscript more than just a curiosity. It is the ultimate symbol of abandonment. It represents a knowledge system that has become so completely detached from its cultural and linguistic context that it is now, for all intents and purposes, a closed book. We can see the information, but we cannot access it. The loss is not one of physical destruction like the Library of Alexandria, but of meaning itself. The language, the terminology, the very framework required to understand its contents has evaporated from human memory without a trace. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable limitations of our modern tools. We can carbon date the vellum, we can analyze the ink, we can run complex statistical models on the character sequences, but all of that tells us about the vehicle, not the message. Without the cultural key, the living tradition that gave birth to it, the knowledge within is permanently inert. This single manuscript is a powerful metaphor for the countless other texts, oral traditions, and entire languages that have vanished without a carbon-dated trace, taking their unique perspectives on the world with them. The enduring mystery of the Voynich manuscript ultimately holds up a mirror to our own assumptions about history and discovery. We live in an age of information, confident that with enough data and processing power, we can solve any puzzle. This book stands as a permanent rebuttal to that arrogance. It is a tangible reminder that there are gaps in our historical record that may never be filled, that some conversations from the past have fallen silent forever. It challenges our deep-seated belief that everything important must and will be rediscovered. Perhaps the manuscript's greatest lesson is not about what it contains, but about the nature of loss itself. It asks us to sit with the humbling reality that some doors to the past have been closed so firmly that no amount of technological ingenuity can pry them open again, leaving us to wonder forever about the secrets they were built to guard. Imagine a weapon so terrifying that it could set the very sea on fire, a liquid flame that clung to enemy ships and men, impossible to extinguish with water, and whose horrific secret was so closely guarded that it vanished from history along with the empire that wielded it. This was Greek fire, the legendary incendiary weapon that served as the ultimate naval deterrent for the Byzantine Empire for over 7 centuries. Its deployment was a spectacle of pure psychological warfare. From the bow of a Byzantine Droman warship, a bronze tube, perhaps mounted on a grotesque beast's head, would project a roaring stream of fire across the waves, the jet igniting with a thunderous roar upon contact with the air. The flames would dance and skitter across the water's surface, engulfing enemy vessels in an inescapable inferno. Historical accounts from besieged Arab fleets describe the sheer terror it inspired. Water only seemed to feed the blaze, and sailors faced the horrifying choice of burning alive or drowning. The strategic advantage was immense. Greek fire was the key reason Constantinople, a city straddling 2 continents, withstood numerous naval sieges and remained the bastion of Christendom for so long. It was more than a weapon. It was a technological marvel that defined an era of warfare. And then it was simply gone. The exact formula, the precise mixture of chemicals, the engineering of the pressurized siphons that delivered it, all of it was lost with the final fall of Constantinople in 1453. The secret died with the last of the imperial engineers, becoming one of history's most enduring and explosive mysteries. The disappearance of Greek fire is a perfect case study in how advanced knowledge can become a victim of its own success. The Byzantine emperors understood the weapon's value was entirely in its exclusivity. The formula wasn't just a state secret, it was a dynastic secret, reportedly passed only from emperor to emperor, or within a single, trusted family of engineers. Writing it down was deemed too great a risk. This strategy of extreme secrecy ensured their military dominance for generations, but it also created a single, fragile point of failure. When the empire finally crumbled under the onslaught of the Ottoman Sultan, maimed the Second's cannons, the institutional knowledge and the few people who possessed it were wiped out. Historians and chemists have speculated for centuries on its composition. The most plausible theories suggest a complex mixture of crude petroleum drawn from natural pools near the Black Sea, combined with quicklime, which ignites on contact with water, and perhaps other ingredients like pine resin to make it sticky, or sulfur to increase its intensity. Modern recreations have come close, but none perfectly match the descriptions of a substance that could be projected in a continuous, burning stream, and that burned so ferociously on water. Its loss is a stark lesson in the inherent fragility of practical, hands-on knowledge that is never widely shared or recorded. This pattern of brilliant innovation followed by total oblivion repeats itself across the ancient world in surprisingly mundane yet profound ways. Consider the humble roads and buildings of the Roman Empire. They built structures that have stood for 2 millennia, weathering earthquakes and the elements, while many of our modern concrete structures show signs of decay within decades. The secret to Roman concrete's legendary durability was only recently uncovered by modern scientists. It turns out the Romans used a mix of volcanic ash, lime, and seawater, and the magic happens at a microscopic level. Over time, seawater percolating through the concrete actually promotes the growth of rare crystalline minerals that reinforce the structure, filling in cracks and making it stronger with age. This self-healing property is a feat of materials science we are only now beginning to replicate, yet this knowledge was lost with the empire's collapse. The elaborate supply chains for specific volcanic ash, the precise mixing ratios, and the understanding of the chemical processes, all of it faded away as societal priorities shifted to basic survival over grand architectural projects. We spent centuries using an inferior product because a superior one had been completely forgotten. In the realm of personal combat, no weapon is more shrouded in myth than the legendary swords of Damascus steel. Forged in India from a unique type of high-carbon steel called woots, these blades were famed throughout the Middle Ages for their incredible strength, flexibility, and a distinctive, mesmerizing watery pattern on their surface. They were said to be sharp enough to slice a silk scarf floating in the air and tough enough to notch a European broadsword without breaking. The secret lay in the intricate forging process, which involved carefully controlling the cooling of the steel to create microscopic structures called carbon nanotubes, an advanced nanomaterial achieved centuries before the concept even existed. But by the 18th century, the sources of the special iron ore in India were depleted, and the exact forging techniques, passed down through generations of smiths in a master-apprentice tradition, were lost. No written manuals existed. The knowledge was in the hands, eyes, and instincts of the craftsmen. When that chain was broken, the ability to create these supernatural blades vanished forever. Modern metallurgists can analyze the finished product and see the nanotubes, but they cannot perfectly reverse engineer the specific, ritualized process of folding, heating, and cooling that created them. The collective loss of these technologies forces us to confront a deeply ethical question. What is our responsibility when we unearth such powerful knowledge? If a chemist were to truly stumble upon the definitive formula for Greek fire, should it be published for all to see? The potential for misuse in modern conflict or terrorism is terrifyingly obvious. Similarly, rediscovering the secret to Roman concrete could revolutionize sustainable construction, reducing the massive carbon footprint of our built environment by creating infrastructure that lasts for centuries instead of decades. But it could also disrupt global economies and industries built around current, less durable methods. And the science behind Damascus steel could lead to breakthroughs in material science, from lighter, stronger alloys for spacecraft to new medical implants. The act of rediscovery is not a neutral event. It comes laden with consequences. These abandoned technologies show us that our ancestors were not primitive. They were ingenious innovators who sometimes reached heights we are still scrambling to reclaim. Their loss is a permanent reminder that progress is not a straight, upward line, and that advanced engineering is a fragile flame, easily extinguished by the winds of war, secrecy, and time. Buried beneath the waves for 2,000 years, encrusted in corrosion and mystery, a lump of bronze and wood hidden inside a Roman shipwreck would eventually reveal a secret so profound it would shatter our understanding of ancient technology. When sponge divers off the coast of the Greek island of Antikythera stumbled upon the wreck in 1901, they were initially drawn to the marble statues and glittering treasures. But it was a nondescript, corroded lump that was carefully hauled ashore with the rest of the artifacts, its significance completely overlooked for decades. It wasn't until a few years later that an archaeologist noticed a single, delicate gear wheel peeking out from a crack in the calcified rock. This was the first glimpse of the Antikythera Mechanism, a device so complex and so anachronistic that it has been called the world's first analog computer, a masterpiece of engineering that feels like it was dropped into the past from a more advanced timeline. For nearly half a century, the mechanism remained a confusing enigma. Then, in the 1970s and again with even more powerful tools in the early 2000s, a team of researchers led by scientists like Tony Freeth and Mike Edmonds used cutting-edge technology to peer inside the crusted remains without destroying them. They employed high-resolution X-ray tomography and three-dimensional surface imaging, the same technologies used to map the human body, to digitally reconstruct the intricate clockwork hidden inside. What they revealed was nothing short of breathtaking. The Antikythera Mechanism was a sophisticated astronomical calculator, a complex system of at least 30 interlocking bronze gear wheels housed in a wooden case about the size of a large shoebox. On the front and back were beautifully inscribed dials and pointers, and an input crank on the side allowed the user to advance or reverse the mechanism in time. It was a portable, hand-powered planetarium of incredible precision. By turning the handle, an ancient Greek astronomer could calculate the positions of the sun and moon, predict lunar and solar eclipses, and even track the movements of the 5 planets known at the time. It modeled the irregular orbit of the moon using a clever pin and slot gear system that accounted for its elliptical path, a complex mathematical concept known as anomaly. One of its dials even tracked the 4-year cycle of the ancient Olympic Games, making it not just a scientific instrument, but a cultural and social calendar as well. The sheer sophistication of these gear trains is what makes the mechanism so utterly staggering. The level of miniaturization and mechanical complexity it displays would not be seen again in clockwork until the great astronomical clocks of 18th century Europe. This device wasn't a primitive prototype, it was the pinnacle of a highly advanced and evidently established tradition of precision engineering. The Greeks of the 1st or 2nd century BCE weren't just dabbling in mechanics, they had achieved a mastery of gear ratios, differential systems, and astronomical modeling that represents a completely lost chapter in the history of technology. The Antikythera Mechanism forces us to ask a deeply unsettling question. If this one device, a luxury item likely owned by a wealthy individual or a school, was this advanced, what else were they capable of building? Were there other mechanisms, perhaps even larger and more complex, that were lost to time? Did this technology have practical applications in navigation, architecture, or even public spectacle? The existence of this single device suggests an entire ecosystem of knowledge theorists who understood the complex mathematics of celestial motion, engineers who could translate those calculations into precise gear ratios, and master craftsmen with the tools and skill to cut those tiny, perfect bronze teeth. The Antikythera Mechanism wasn't a miracle. It was a product of its time, and that is the most revolutionary idea of all. So how does an entire technological tradition this advanced simply vanish for over 1,000 years? The abandonment of this knowledge wasn't due to a single fire or invasion, but a slow, grinding collapse of the world that created and sustained it. The mechanism was built during the Hellenistic period, a golden age of Greek science following the conquests of Alexander the Great. This was an era of great institutions like the Library of Alexandria, where state patronage funded ambitious research and a culture of competitive intellectual inquiry flourished across the Mediterranean. But this interconnected world was beginning to fracture. As the Roman Republic expanded, it absorbed these Greek territories, and while the Romans admired Greek culture, their practical, engineering-focused mindset may have had less interest in supporting the complex theoretical science that underpinned devices like the Antikythera Mechanism. The knowledge required to build it was likely held by a very small, specialized group of scholars and artisans. As political instability grew, funding dried up, and trade routes became more dangerous, this fragile chain of transmission was easily broken. The specialized workshops that produced such intricate devices would have disappeared. The great libraries that housed the technical manuals and astronomical theories were sacked or fell into decay. Within a few generations, the very memory of how to create such a machine was lost, its purpose fading into myth until it was literally buried at the bottom of the sea. The legacy of the Antikythera Mechanism is a profound lesson in the fragility of progress. Its rediscovery is a powerful reminder that societal collapse, not a lack of intelligence or creativity, is often the true engine of abandonment. The ancient Greeks had the ingenuity to create a computer, but their civilization lacked the resilience to preserve the knowledge of how to build it. This single artifact rewrites the history of technology, proving that our linear narrative of constant advancement is a comforting illusion. It forces us to confront the haunting possibility that other marvels, perhaps even greater than this one, were lost forever in the chaos of history's turning points, their potential to alter the course of human development sinking silently beneath the waves, leaving not even a ripple on the surface of time. Across the Atlantic, during the very centuries when the great libraries of the Islamic world were flourishing, another civilization was reaching its own breathtaking intellectual peak in the dense rainforests of Mesoamerica. The Maya developed one of the most complex and sophisticated worldviews in human history, a system of knowledge that seamlessly wove together astronomy, mathematics, and theology into a single, cohesive understanding of the cosmos. Theirs was a civilization of precise calendars that could stretch across millennia, of observatories that tracked the cycles of Venus with astonishing accuracy, and of a mathematical concept so advanced it would elude Europe for hundreds of years, the concept of zero. This entire intellectual universe was primarily recorded in thousands of bark paper books, known as Codices, which were painted by scribes and studied by a priestly class. And then, in a single, devastating campaign of cultural annihilation, nearly all of it was deliberately burned to ashes. The primary agent of this destruction was a single man, Friar Diego de Landa, a Spanish Franciscan missionary who arrived in the Yucatan in the mid-16th century. He came with a mission to save souls, but he viewed Maya culture and spirituality not as something to be understood, but as a diabolical competitor to be utterly eradicated. In July of 1562, in a single horrific auto-da-fe in the town of Mani, de Landa orchestrated the burning of a vast treasure trove of Maya knowledge. He gathered every codex, every painted book he could find, and piled them into a giant pyre. Historical accounts describe it as a massive conflagration, consuming an estimated 27 sacred scrolls and countless other documents. While the exact number is debated, the symbolic act is terrifyingly clear. De Landa himself wrote, "We found a large number of books in these characters, and as they contained nothing in which there were not to be seen superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all." In that one act, he didn't just burn paper, he attempted to incinerate an entire civilization's memory, its history, its science, and its soul. The few codices that survived did so only by chance, hidden away or taken to Europe as curiosities before the full force of this ideological purge took hold. The profound tragedy of this loss is crystallized in the few precious codices that made it through the flames. The most famous of these is the Dresden Codex, a stunningly beautiful and complex document that serves as a window into the magnificent world of Maya astronomy. To the untrained eye, it looks like a series of intricate, almost hallucinogenic paintings of gods, animals, and enigmatic bar and dot symbols. But to scholars who have painstakingly decoded it, the Dresden Codex is revealed to be a sophisticated astronomical almanac and a precision calculator for time. Its most celebrated section contains incredibly detailed tables for tracking the movements of the planet Venus. The Maya observed that Venus has a 584-day cycle between its appearances as the morning star and the evening star. Their priest astronomers used the codex to predict these celestial events with an accuracy measured in just hours over a span of centuries. This wasn't just an academic exercise, it was deeply tied to their religion and warfare. The rising of Venus was associated with the god Kukulkan and was believed to be an inauspicious time, portending chaos and conflict. Rulers would plan military campaigns based on these celestial predictions, believing they were aligning their actions with the very rhythm of the gods. The mathematical system that enabled these precise calculations was in itself a revolutionary achievement. While European mathematicians were still struggling with cumbersome Roman numerals, the Maya had developed a place value system that included the concept of zero, represented by a shell-like symbol. This was a conceptual leap of staggering proportions, as zero is not just a number but a placeholder that gives all other numbers their full power and flexibility. Furthermore, they used a base 20 decimal system instead of our base 10 decimal system. This means they counted in multiples of 20, a system that some scholars suggest may have originated from the total number of human fingers and toes. Using just 3 symbols, a dot for 1, a bar for 5, and the shell for 0, they could write any number and perform complex calculations for their calendars and astronomical predictions. Their long count calendar could pinpoint any day across a span of thousands of years with absolute precision, a feat of mathematical chronology that was unparalleled at the time. This innovation was so complete, so advanced, that it was developed entirely independently from any influence from Europe or Asia, making its loss all the more catastrophic for the global history of mathematics. The burning of the codices means that the Dresden, Madrid, and Paris codices named for the cities where they eventually ended up are merely tantalizing fragments of a vast lost library. We are left trying to reconstruct an entire intellectual cathedral from a handful of scattered bricks. Scholars like Michael D. Coe have emphasized that these surviving books are primarily ritual and astronomical in nature. This means we have lost virtually everything else. What of their histories, their detailed accounts of kings, wars, and dynasties? What of their extensive knowledge of ecology? The Maya were master botanists. They cultivated forests, understood the medicinal properties of hundreds of plants, and developed sustainable agricultural practices to feed large urban populations. All of that practical, life-sustaining knowledge is almost entirely gone. Their literature, their poetry, their philosophies, the very sound of their thoughts have been largely silenced. We can see glimpses of it in the glyphs carved on stone stelae and temple walls, but the full, rich context provided by the books is lost forever. We are left with a magnificent but silent film, where we can see the actors and the sets but have lost the soundtrack and the script. This act of intentional destruction forces a painful reflection on the nature of cultural suppression. The conquest of the Maya was not just a military victory, it was an ideological one designed to replace an entire worldview. By burning the codices, De Lander and others like him weren't just destroying objects, they were attempting to sever a people from their own past, their own identity, and their own way of understanding the universe. They believed their own system of knowledge was the only one that held any value or truth, and in their zeal, they irrevocably impoverished all of humanity. The story of the Maya codices is the most stark example of how knowledge isn't just passively lost to the slow erosion of time. It can be actively, deliberately targeted for eradication. It stands as a permanent warning about the dangers of ideological certainty and a profound lesson in the incalculable value of preserving the diverse, beautiful, and unique ways that human beings have always sought to make sense of the world around them. While the tragic burning of the Maya codices represents a deliberate act of cultural destruction, the loss of knowledge is often a far more complex process, one born not from malice but from the slow unraveling of the very networks that sustain it. This brings us to one of history's most magnificent and fragile systems of intellectual exchange, the Silk Road. We often picture it as a romantic caravan route, a string of camels laden with silks and spices winding through deserts and over mountain passes. But to see it only as a conduit for luxury goods is to miss its true revolutionary power. The Silk Road was the ancient world's internet, a sprawling, decentralized network of overland and maritime pathways that connected the Han Dynasty in China to the Roman Empire in the West. For centuries, it facilitated the most vital exchange of all, the trade of ideas, technologies, and entire worldviews. It was on these routes that knowledge, not just merchandise, flowed across continents, weaving together the intellectual destinies of civilizations and creating a shared reservoir of human understanding that was, sadly, as vulnerable as it was vast. The movement of Buddhist thought from India into China stands as a perfect testament to this intellectual commerce. It wasn't just monks making this journey, it was a massive, centuries-long translation project. Buddhist sutras written in Sanskrit and Pali were carried along the trade routes into Central Asia and China, where they encountered a civilization with a deeply rooted philosophical tradition of its own. To make these foreign concepts resonate, translators had to perform a kind of intellectual alchemy, often using Taoist terminology to explain Buddhist ideas. This wasn't a simple word-for-word substitution. It was a creative fusion that gave birth to entirely new schools of thought, like Chan Buddhism in China, which would later become Zen in Japan. This cross-pollination enriched both cultures immeasurably, but it was entirely dependent on the stability of the states that protected the routes and the monasteries that served as way stations and cultural centers. When that stability faltered, the dialogue could be severed for centuries, leaving traditions isolated and incomplete. The flow of knowledge was by no means one way. While silk moved west, crucial technologies moved east from the Islamic world into a Europe that was slowly emerging from its feudal isolation. A key hub for this transfer was the Spanish city of Toledo, reconquered by Christian forces in the 11th century. The Christian victors didn't destroy the vast libraries they found. Instead, they established a famous translation school. There, teams of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars worked side by side to translate the great works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Ibn Sina from Arabic into Latin. This torrent of recovered knowledge, encompassing medicine, astronomy, and philosophy, became the very fuel for the European Renaissance and the scientific revolution. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas were able to engage with Aristotle's logic only because it had been preserved and expanded upon by Islamic scholars centuries earlier, and then delivered back to Europe via these Silk Road networks. The entire intellectual trajectory of the West was fundamentally altered by this retrieved knowledge, a debt that was often forgotten as Europe rose to global prominence. Some of the most dramatic examples of the Silk Road's role involved technologies that were transferred, lost in their place of origin, and only rediscovered centuries later. The history of gunpowder is a classic case. First developed by Chinese alchemists during the Tang Dynasty, its formula traveled west along the trade routes, likely through the Mongol Empire, which acted as a vast, if brutal, conduit for technological exchange. The Islamic world and then Europe rapidly adapted the technology for warfare, developing cannons and firearms that would forever change the nature of combat. Meanwhile, in China itself, A shift in political priorities and philosophy during the Ming Dynasty led to a de-emphasis on military innovation. The very technology they had invented was, in many ways, abandoned and then surpassed by the West, only to be reintroduced to China centuries later by European powers in a devastatingly advanced form. A similar story can be told about printing with movable type, pioneered in Korea and China long before Gutenberg. While it revolutionized publishing in East Asia, the technology never made the full journey west in time to influence Europe independently. Gutenberg had to reinvent it, demonstrating how a broken network could lead to the independent and wasteful rediscovery of what was already known. So what caused this vibrant, world-changing network to eventually fracture and fade? The decline was not a single event but a cascade of political and biological disasters. The rise and fall of empires constantly reshaped the map of safe passage. The Mongol Empire, for all its violence, had briefly created a unified and relatively secure zone from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, a phenomenon historians call the Pax Mongolica, which greatly facilitated exchange. But as the empire fragmented into competing khanates, the routes became contested and dangerous again. Then came the single greatest shock, the Black Death. This pandemic, which likely traveled along the Silk Road itself from Central Asia in the 14th century, killed a staggering proportion of the population from China to Europe. The devastation was so complete that it crippled economies, depopulated cities, and fostered a deep-seated fear of outsiders and long-distance travel. The intricate web of merchants, translators, and scholars that had sustained the knowledge network was decimated, and the world turned inward for generations. This collective trauma, combined with the rise of new maritime routes pioneered by European navigators, gradually rendered the overland Silk Road obsolete, and much of the shared knowledge it carried was forgotten in one place while being preserved in another. This history forces us to confront a pressing modern parallel. In our era of digital globalization, we have built a knowledge network infinitely faster and more vast than the Silk Road could ever have been. Information can circle the globe in milliseconds, and collaborative projects connect minds across every border. This offers us an unprecedented opportunity to prevent the kind of catastrophic losses that afflicted the ancient world. A discovery made in a lab in Brazil can be instantly accessed by a researcher in Japan. A cultural tradition can be digitally preserved and shared with descendants on another continent. Yet, this hyperconnectivity also creates terrifying new vulnerabilities. Our knowledge is increasingly centralized on corporate servers and in proprietary formats. What happens if a geopolitical conflict fractures the global internet into isolated fragments, a phenomenon often called the splinternet? Could a cyber pandemic or a massive solar flare wipe out the digital repositories that hold our collective memory? The story of the Silk Road teaches us that knowledge is not a static trophy to be won and kept, but a living, breathing ecosystem that requires constant care, open access, and diverse pathways to survive. It shows us that the greatest threat to progress is not a lack of innovation, but a failure of connection. For centuries, the story of early Christianity was told as a single, unified narrative, a straight line from the teachings of Jesus to the established doctrines of the Church. But what if that history is not a straight line at all, but a sprawling, vibrant tree with many branches, most of which were deliberately pruned away? This is the profound mystery unveiled by the discovery of the Gnostic scriptures, a collection of texts that present a radically different vision of the Christian message, one that was largely erased from history until a momentous find in the Egyptian desert. In 1945, an Arab peasant named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging for fertilizer near the town of Nag Hammadi when his hoe struck something hard. It wasn't a rock but a large, sealed clay jar. Hoping for treasure, he smashed it open. Inside, he found not gold, but 13 leather-bound codices containing 52 ancient texts. These were not the familiar books of the New Testament. They were writings with mysterious names like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Secret Book of John. This was the Nag Hammadi Library, and it was nothing less than a time capsule, preserving a whole spectrum of early Christian thought that had been condemned, suppressed, and thought lost forever. These texts, known broadly as the Gnostic Gospels, pull back the curtain on a far more diverse and complex spiritual movement than we ever knew existed. The word Gnostic comes from the Greek gnosis, which means not intellectual knowledge, but a deep, intuitive knowledge of the heart, a personal revelation of divine truth. For the Gnostics, the path to salvation wasn't through faith alone or by simply following church authority, but through this direct, personal experience of the divine within. This immediately set them at odds with the growing institutional church, which was increasingly emphasizing a fixed set of beliefs, a standardized canon of scripture, and a structured hierarchy of bishops to interpret it all. The Gnostic texts often read like mystical poetry or philosophical dialogues, filled with symbolism and a different kind of story about Jesus. In the Gospel of Thomas, for instance, Jesus says, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." This is a call to look inward for the kingdom of God, a stark contrast to the more externalized, communal salvation being preached by the emerging Orthodox Church. Another text, the Secret Book of John, presents a complex cosmology where the material world is not created by the ultimate, transcendent God, but by a lesser, flawed being called the Demiurge. In this view, human beings contain a divine spark trapped in the material world, and the purpose of Jesus' teaching is to awaken us to our true spiritual origin and help us return to the divine source. This alternative vision was not a minor heresy on the fringes. For the first few centuries, it was a vibrant and significant part of the Christian conversation. As renowned scholar Elaine Pagels has argued in her groundbreaking work, these texts reveal that early Christianity was a bubbling cauldron of debate and diversity. There was no single monolithic church but many different groups: Jewish Christians, Pauline Christians, and various Gnostic communities, all interpreting the message of Jesus in their own way. They debated fiercely: was the God of the Old Testament the same as the God revealed by Jesus? Was the material world fundamentally good as a creation of God, or was it a prison from which we needed to escape? Was salvation achieved through the Church's sacraments or through personal, mystical insight? This was a time of searching, of experimentation, of rich theological creativity. The Nag Hammadi Library shows us that the ideas that would eventually be labeled as orthodox were just one set of answers among many, and for a time, they were not necessarily the majority view. So why did one form of Christianity win out and actively suppress the others? The reasons were as much political as they were theological. The critical turning point was the 4th century and the reign of the Roman Emperor Constantine. When Constantine converted to Christianity, he didn't just adopt a new faith, he effectively nationalized it. He saw a unified church as a tool for unifying a fractured empire. A religion with multiple, competing truths and no central authority was a threat to this political project. Constantine needed one church, one creed, one hierarchy he could work with. This led to the Council of Nicaea in 325, where bishops gathered to standardize Christian doctrine and squash what they deemed heretical deviations. The Gnostics, with their emphasis on personal revelation over clerical authority and their complicated cosmologies that could seem elitist, were a primary target. Bishops like Irenaeus of Lyons wrote massive volumes like Against Heresies, specifically to discredit and condemn Gnostic teachings. The goal was to create a clear, simple, and universally accessible faith that could be easily administered by a network of bishops loyal to the imperial church. The diverse, mystical, and philosophically complex strands of Christianity represented by the Gnostics did not fit this new mold. They were a threat to the very idea of a single, authoritative truth. The suppression that followed was systematic and effective. Gnostic texts were hunted down and burned. Their communities were dispersed and silenced. Within a few generations, their voices were completely erased from the official record. For over 1,600 years, the only knowledge we had of them came from the writings of their opponents, who naturally caricatured their beliefs. It was as if we were trying to understand a modern political movement by reading only the attack ads from its rivals. The discovery at Nag Hammadi changed everything. It gave these suppressed communities their voice back, allowing us to hear their side of the story for the first time. This forces a profound reflection on the nature of religious history. What does it mean that the version of Christianity that triumphed was the one most amenable to political power and institutional control? How might Western history have been different if a more mystical, introspective, and personally experiential form of Christianity had become the dominant tradition? The loss of the Gnostic path meant the silencing of a powerful counter-narrative that emphasized inner transformation over outer conformity and direct experience over received dogma. The rediscovery of these texts is not about replacing one orthodoxy with another. It's about recovering a lost dimension of spiritual seeking that still speaks powerfully to many today. In a modern world where countless people describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, the Gnostic emphasis on personal journey and inner authority feels strikingly contemporary. Their texts can contribute immensely to interfaith dialogue, as they often present a vision of divinity that is less about a singular, anthropomorphic God and more about an ineffable, transcendent source from which all existence flows, a concept that finds echoes in Eastern philosophies like Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta. The Gnostic story is a sobering lesson in how knowledge systems, especially spiritual ones, can be deliberately abandoned not because they lack value or truth, but because they challenge the structures of authority that seek to consolidate control. It shows us that what we often accept as timeless tradition is, in fact, the product of ancient political battles, and that other ways of understanding the sacred, perhaps just as valid, were cast into the shadows, waiting centuries for the light to find them again. High in the Andes Mountains, the Inca Empire faced an engineering nightmare that would challenge modern builders even today. They needed to feed a vast population across some of the most precipitous and earthquake-prone terrain on Earth, with slopes so steep that rainfall would simply wash the precious soil away. Their solution was not to fight the mountain, but to reshape it with breathtaking elegance into a cascading series of stepped terraces. These were not simple garden plots, they were complex, multi-layered agricultural systems. The Incas constructed massive stone retaining walls that were precisely angled to absorb the seismic energy of frequent earthquakes, a technique we now call ashlar masonry, where stones are cut to fit together without mortar so perfectly that you cannot slide a knife blade between them. Behind these walls, they built a sophisticated substrate, a bottom layer of large stones for drainage, followed by layers of smaller gravel, sand, and finally, rich topsoil hauled up from the valleys. This created deep, well-drained beds that prevented erosion and allowed them to cultivate over 70 different crops from potatoes to maize, at altitudes previously thought impossible for agriculture. But the true genius of these terraces lay in their integration with a continent-spanning hydraulic system. The Incas engineered a network of stone canals and aqueducts that captured melting glacial water from the mountain peaks and distributed it with precise gravity-fed control to every single terrace. They understood hydraulic engineering so intimately that they built these canals with just the right slope, not too steep to cause erosion, not too shallow to allow stagnation, to maintain a constant, gentle flow of water that nourished the crops and mitigated frost damage by regulating the microclimate. This was agriculture as an act of geoengineering, a symbiotic relationship with a demanding landscape that turned the vertiginous Andes into a fertile breadbasket for millions. Meanwhile, in the seasonal deserts of the Maya world, a different water crisis was unfolding. The Yucatan Peninsula is a flat limestone shelf with no visible rivers or lakes. Rainfall either floods the surface during torrential wet seasons or disappears instantly into the porous bedrock, leaving the region parched for months on end. To support vast, sprawling city-states like Tikal and Caracol, the Maya became masters of hydrology, creating a water management system of staggering complexity. Their entire urban planning revolved around capturing, storing, and conserving every single drop of water. At the heart of their cities were immense, plaster-lined reservoirs capable of holding millions of gallons. The layout of plazas and causeways was carefully engineered to funnel rainwater from paved surfaces into these central tanks. They even created constructed wetlands, using aquatic plants to naturally filter and purify the water before it entered the storage system. In the city of Palenque, they built an underground, masonry-lined aqueduct that redirected a river to flow beneath the main plaza, solving flood control issues while providing a constant source of fresh, cool running water, a feat of engineering that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. The Maya understood their environment with such precision that they could sustain populations' density comparable to modern cities in a landscape that appears, to the untrained eye, utterly inhospitable to large-scale human settlement. Theirs was a civilization built not in spite of the environment, but through a profound and intimate dialogue with its every nuance. The sophistication of these systems extended beyond physical infrastructure into the realm of information management, a mystery that continues to tantalize archaeologists today. The Inca, who had no known written language, administered their vast empire using an ingenious device called the quipu. A quipu was a collection of colorful cotton or wool cords hanging from a main string, with a complex language of knots tied at different positions to represent numerical data. The type of knot, its position on the cord, and the color and material of the string itself encoded a vast array of information. Most scholars agree that quipus were used as accounting tools, recording census data, tributes, and warehouse inventories with a decimal precision that would have been the envy of any medieval European clerk. But some researchers, like Harvard anthropologist Gary Urton, propose that they were far more complex, potentially capable of encoding narrative histories, laws, and even literature, making them a three-dimensional, tactile writing system unlike any other in the world. The Spanish conquistadors, recognizing the quipu's power as an instrument of state control, systematically sought out and destroyed them, condemning this unique knowledge technology to oblivion. Today, out of an estimated many thousands, only about 600 quipus survive, and their full lexical code remains only partially broken. Each one is a silent, knotted archive, a library of lost knowledge whose complete contents we may never fully access, representing the utter fragility of information systems that rely on a specialized class of readers who themselves were wiped out by disease and conquest. The abandonment of this profound engineering and administrative wisdom was not a gradual decline but a sudden, catastrophic collapse triggered by the arrival of Europeans. The single greatest cause was pandemic disease. Old world illnesses like smallpox, measles, and influenza raced ahead of the conquistadors, devastating populations that had no immunological defense. It is estimated that within a century, up to 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas perished. This apocalyptic demographic crash meant there were simply not enough people left to maintain the incredibly labor-intensive terraces, canals, and reservoirs. Without teams of engineers to constantly clear silt from the aqueducts or repair the stone walls of the terraces, these systems began to fail. The conquest itself completed the job. Spanish policies deliberately dismantled the old social order, concentrating the surviving populations into new towns to better control and Christianize them, severing their physical and spiritual connection to the land. The new economic model prioritized mining and ranching over the intricate, sustainable agriculture that had once fed empires. As a result, the hillsides the Incas had so carefully sculpted began to erode, and the sophisticated water tanks of the Maya world silted up and were reclaimed by the jungle. The land itself began to forget the knowledge that had sustained it, and within a few generations, the very memory of how these systems worked was lost, even to the descendants of their builders. The rediscovery of these techniques by modern archaeologists offers not just a window into the past, but a potential blueprint for a more sustainable future. Scientists are now studying the chemical composition of the Amazonian dark earth, or terra preta, to understand how to create long-lasting, self-fertilizing soils that could reduce our dependence on chemical additives. Engineers are looking at the Incas' seismic-resistant mortarless masonry and gravity-fed water systems as models for building resilient infrastructure in developing nations and earthquake zones. Urban planners are fascinated by the Mayas' holistic approach to water management, seeing in their reservoir and wetland systems a precedent for modern green infrastructure that manages stormwater runoff naturally. The question this ancient wisdom poses to us is urgent and humbling. In an era of climate change and water scarcity, what if the solutions to some of our most pressing problems are not to be found in new technologies, but in the rediscovery of old ones? What if the path forward involves looking back to a time when human societies saw themselves not as separate from their environment, but as integrated participants, whose survival depended on understanding and working with the natural world's complex systems, rather than seeking to dominate and simplify them? The abandoned engineering of the Americas stands as a monumental testament to that forgotten partnership, a silent challenge to our modern assumptions of superiority, and a compelling invitation to learn from the profound practical wisdom of the past. Imagine a civilization so advanced and so vibrant that its very memory became the source of our greatest myths. This was the world of the Minoans, a Bronze Age society that flourished on the island of Crete, a people who built vast, labyrinthine palace complexes without defensive walls, whose artists painted breathtaking frescoes of leaping dolphins and graceful bull leapers, and who developed Europe's first known system of writing. Then, around 1450 before the Common Era, their world suddenly and violently collapsed. The palaces were burned, the population declined, and their culture was absorbed and overwritten by the incoming Mycenaeans from mainland Greece. In the ashes of this catastrophe, one of history's most tantalizing puzzles was left behind. Hundreds of clay tablets inscribed with an elegant, swirling script we now call Linear A. This is not just an undeciphered text, it is the locked door to an entire civilization's mind. Behind it lies everything we wish to know about the Minoans, their poetry, their laws, their prayers to their mysterious gods, their very thoughts. And we have lost the key. The challenge of cracking Linear A's code is a nightmare for linguists, a puzzle that makes the Voynich manuscript look simple by comparison. The script itself is understood well enough. It's a syllabic system, meaning each symbol represents a syllable like pa, tai, or ro, and it's accompanied by a series of logograms or picture symbols for common items like wine, figs, or chariots. We can even sound out the words. The problem is, those sounds are meaningless. Without a Minoan to English dictionary, we are left pronouncing a language we do not understand. The primary reason for this impasse is the absence of what decipherers dream of, a bilingual text. The Rosetta Stone, which provided the same text in 3 scripts, including known ancient Greek, was the key that unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphics. For Linear A, no such stone exists. There is no parallel text, no handy Minoan for beginners guide left behind to bridge the gap between their world and ours. Every attempt at decipherment is therefore a shot in the dark, a series of educated guesses based on statistical analysis, comparisons with later scripts, and sheer intellectual bravery. Linguists can identify potential place names or words for commodities, but the grammar, the syntax, the soul of the language remains utterly opaque. It is like having a beautifully composed musical score, but no idea what the notes sound like when played. This profound loss is thrown into sharp, painful relief when we compare it to the story of Linear A's successor, Linear B. When the Mycenaeans conquered Crete, they didn't invent a new writing system. They adapted the existing Linear A script to write their own language. For decades, both scripts were undeciphered and were thought to represent the same Minoan language. Then, in 1952, a brilliant young architect named Michael Ventris made a breathtaking breakthrough. Applying a codebreaker's logic and a linguist's intuition, he proved that Linear B was not used to write Minoan, but a very early form of Greek. Ventris's decipherment blew the doors off our understanding of the Bronze Age. Suddenly, these dry administrative lists came to life, revealing a world of Mycenaean warlords, their inventories of chariots and armor, their lists of slaves and religious offerings. We learned the names of their gods like Poseidon and Zeus, who were already being worshipped. We gained insight into a highly organized, bureaucratic palatial economy. The decipherment of Linear B was one of the greatest archaeological achievements of the 20th century, but it also came with a cruel irony. In giving voice to the Mycenaeans, it forever silenced the Minoans. The Linear B tablets, written in Greek, became the loudest voice in the room, drowning out the whispers of the earlier, still mysterious Linear A. We can read the conqueror's paperwork, but the original author's literature is lost to us. The consequence of this silence is a historical void of staggering proportions. We can walk through the spectacular ruins of the Palace of Knossos, with its complex architecture and vibrant art, and we can make educated guesses about Minoan society. We can assume they were a sophisticated, maritime trading power, likely matriarchal or matrifocal, given the prominence of goddess figures in their art. We can infer they had a complex religion involving bull symbolism and sacred double axes, but without their own words, these are just inferences. We have no Minoan history written by the Minoans. No epic poems, no royal decrees, no personal letters, no sacred hymns. We don't know what they called themselves. The name Minoan comes from the later Greek myth of King Minos. We don't know the names of their deities, only the symbols used to represent them. We have no idea why they built those vast, labyrinth-like palaces, or what political or religious ideas they were designed to express. The loss of Linear means the loss of their identity, their voice, their inner world. It reduces a complex, vibrant civilization to a beautiful but silent archaeological museum exhibit. This single, undeciphered script is a powerful metaphor for a much larger and more universal tragedy, the death of a language. When a language dies, it is not merely a set of words that fades away. It is an entire universe of knowledge, a unique way of seeing and categorizing the world that vanishes forever. Language is the primary vessel for cultural memory, for philosophy, for humor, for the subtle nuances of relationship and place. The loss of linear represents the ultimate language death, one so complete that it severs all cultural continuity. The modern inhabitants of Crete, though living on the same land, have no linguistic connection to the Minoans. There is no thread of story, no folk memory embedded in vocabulary, no ancient turn of phrase that survives in the modern dialect. The abandonment of their linguistic knowledge created a clean, absolute break, making the Minoans a true lost civilization. Their worldview, once as rich and complex as our own, has been erased not by time, but by the loss of the one tool that could have preserved it. Their silent script is a permanent reminder that history is written not only by the victors, but also by those who are fortunate enough to have their words survive the relentless passage of time. For far too long, the global narrative of innovation and intellectual history has been sketched with glaring omissions, as if the vast continent of Africa was a blank space on the map of human achievement. This was not an accident of history, but a deliberate act of erasure, a consequence of colonialism and a biased historiography that chose to portray Africa as a land without a past, waiting for the light of external influence to arrive. But the truth, now being vigorously and rightfully reclaimed, reveals a continent that was not just a participant in the story of civilization, but a brilliant and prolific creator of its own sophisticated knowledge systems. From the desert universities of the West to the stone cities of the South, Africa fostered intellectual traditions of breathtaking depth and complexity, traditions that were systematically neglected, dismantled, and abandoned, not because they lacked value, but because they challenged the very justification for foreign domination. We can begin to grasp the scale of this lost world in the fabled city of Timbuktu, a name that became synonymous in the European imagination with the most remote place on Earth. But for the scholars of the medieval Mali and Songhai empires, Timbuktu was not the end of the world, it was its center. Between the 13th and 17th centuries, it was a dazzling nexus of learning, a Saharan Oxford, where thousands of students gathered to study at renowned institutions like the Sankore University. The heart of this intellectual revolution was not stored in stone libraries, but in hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, meticulously handwritten on paper and bound in leather. These were not simple religious texts. They were advanced treatises on astronomy, with precise charts tracking the movements of stars and planets. They were complex mathematical texts exploring algebra and geometry. They were legal documents outlining sophisticated frameworks for governance and justice. They were medical manuals detailing surgical procedures and pharmacological recipes using local plants. This was a literate, scholarly, and deeply curious culture that was actively engaging with the biggest questions of science, philosophy, and law. The survival of these manuscripts, often hidden away in chests and passed down through families for generations, is a testament to the resilience of this knowledge in the face of its attempted annihilation. A similar story of advanced and subsequently abandoned genius unfolds over 2,000 miles to the southeast at the majestic ruins of Great Zimbabwe. This was the capital of a powerful Shona kingdom that thrived between the 11th and 15th centuries, and its very architecture is a silent library of lost engineering knowledge. The structures, particularly the great enclosure, are built entirely of stone without any mortar. The walls, soaring over 30 feet high, are masterclasses in dry stone walling. The stones are perfectly cut and stacked, curving into elegant, gravity-defying formations that have withstood centuries of weather. The techniques used to quarry, shape, and fit these granite blocks so precisely have been lost to time. The complex layout of the city, with its concentric walls and narrow passageways, suggests a deep understanding of spatial planning, acoustics, and perhaps even celestial alignments. After the kingdom's decline, the knowledge behind this architectural marvel faded. Later European colonizers, refusing to believe that indigenous Africans could have created something so magnificent, propagated absurd theories that it must have been the work of Phoenicians, Arabs, or even the biblical King Solomon. This racist denial was a second abandonment, a psychological theft that sought to sever the people of the region from their own magnificent heritage. This pattern of dismissing African innovation is repeated in the story of the Benin Bronzes. When British forces sacked the Kingdom of Benin in 1897, they looted thousands of intricate brass plaques and sculptures. These weren't primitive artifacts, they were stunningly detailed works of art that also served as a historical record for the kingdom. The technical skill required to create them is astonishing. The Benin Guild of Artisans used a complex lost wax casting technique that was arguably more advanced than anything being done in Europe at the same time. They could cast massive, heavy objects with perfect, even walls, achieving a level of detail that included delicate jewelry carved on the figures in solid metal. The artistic sophistication, the understanding of metallurgy, and the sheer organizational capacity to run such a workshop all speak to a highly advanced and complex society. The looting of these bronzes was not just the theft of objects, it was the violent disruption of a living knowledge system, an artistic and technological tradition that was brutally interrupted and has struggled to be fully revived. Along the Swahili coast, a different kind of knowledge flourished, one carved not in stone or metal, but mapped onto the open ocean. For centuries, Swahili sailors mastered the Indian Ocean trade routes, connecting the continent to Arabia, India, and China. Their success was built on a profound and intimate understanding of maritime science. They piloted massive, lateen-sailed dhows using a sophisticated knowledge of the monsoon winds, harnessing these seasonal patterns for efficient travel. They were expert celestial navigators, reading the stars, the sun, and the moon with a precision that allowed them to traverse vast distances of open water. They developed a complex vocabulary for the sea, its currents, and its weather patterns, a knowledge system passed down through generations of sailors. The colonial era, with its steamships and European-dominated trade networks, gradually rendered this indigenous nautical science obsolete, and much of its intricate detail has been lost to time. The Senegalese historian and physicist Cheikh Anta Diop spent his life fighting against this tide of historical amnesia. In works like Civilization or Barbarism, he argued passionately for the need to center Africa in world history, providing meticulous evidence of its contributions to mathematics, astronomy, governance, and architecture. He challenged the Western Academy to acknowledge that the roots of Greek philosophy and science itself were deeply entangled with Egyptian, and by extension, African knowledge. Diop's work was a clarion call to reclaim this stolen legacy, to understand that the abandonment of African knowledge was not a natural process of decay, but an active project of ideological suppression. This reclamation is far more than an academic exercise. It is a powerful act of cultural and psychological restoration. What does it mean for a young person in Mali or Zimbabwe to learn that their ancestors built world-class universities and engineered monumental cities? How does it reshape the global perspective to truly internalize that innovation is a universal human trait, not the exclusive province of one continent. The story of Africa's abandoned knowledge systems is a vital correction to a broken historical record. It challenges us to expand our definition of civilization itself and to listen for the echoes of genius in places we have too long been taught were silent. Amidst the ruins of classical antiquity and the rise of new empires, a different kind of synthesis was taking shape in the vibrant, multicultural cauldron of Hellenistic Egypt. Here, in the city of Alexandria, Greek philosophers, Egyptian priests, and Jewish mystics began a conversation that would give birth to one of history's most enduring and enigmatic knowledge systems, Hermeticism. This was not a rigid dogma, but a profound spiritual and intellectual current that sought to weave together the highest insights of reason and revelation into a unified vision of the cosmos. At its heart was the legendary figure of Hermes Trismegistus, or thrice greatest Hermes, a syncretic fusion of the Greek god Hermes, the messenger of the gods, and the Egyptian god Thoth, the divine scribe and patron of wisdom. This composite sage was believed to have penned a series of sacred texts that contained the primordial wisdom of the world, a complete philosophy that explained everything from the nature of the divine to the practical workings of alchemy and astrology. Hermeticism offered a radical and empowering idea that the human mind, a microcosm of the divine macrocosm, could not only understand the universe but actively participate in its mysteries through will, imagination, and spiritual discipline. It was a philosophy of connection, asserting that the celestial and the terrestrial, the spiritual and the material, were not separate realms but intimately linked in a great, living chain of being. This worldview was crystallized in a collection of texts known as the Corpus Hermeticum, dialogues purportedly between Hermes and his disciples like Asclepius and Tat. These writings, likely composed between the 1st and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, present a cosmos alive with meaning and intelligence. One of their most central tenets is the principle, as above, so below, a concept that would echo through the centuries. This was not merely an observation of similarity but a fundamental law of correspondence. It suggested that the patterns of the stars and planets, the above, were directly reflected in the events of the earthly realm and even within the human soul, the below. This made the universe intelligible and knowable, not through dissection and analysis, but through analogy, symbolism, and inner experience. The Hermetic texts describe a process of divine emanation, where all of creation flows from a single, transcendent, ineffable source often called the All or the One. Humanity in this schema holds a unique and exalted position. The human being is a divine animal, a second God, possessing a mind that can comprehend the cosmos and a creative spirit that can shape reality. The ultimate goal of the Hermetic path was a spiritual rebirth, a gnosis or direct knowledge of the divine that would allow the individual to throw off the shackles of material illusion and reclaim their true celestial nature. For over a millennium, these ideas lay dormant in the West, preserved in Byzantine libraries while Europe passed through the early Middle Ages. Their rediscovery in the 15th century, when a monk brought a copy of the Corpus Hermeticum to the court of Cosimo de' Medici in Florence, ignited the intellectual imagination of the Renaissance. Marsilio Ficino, the brilliant scholar tasked with translating the text, was so captivated that he put his work on Plato aside, believing Hermes to be a far more ancient and primal source of wisdom. The timing was perfect. The Hermetic vision of an empowered humanity, capable of understanding and manipulating the natural world through will and intellect, resonated perfectly with the burgeoning humanist spirit. It provided a spiritual framework for the era's explosive curiosity and its drive to explore and master nature. This wasn't a dusty antique. It was a revolutionary manifesto that placed humanity at the creative center of the universe. Its influence seeped into the very foundations of Renaissance art, science, and magic. The great artist and inventor Leonardo da Vinci's belief in the profound connection between the microcosm of man and the macrocosm of the world is deeply hermetic. Even the architecture of the period, with its perfectly proportioned buildings designed to reflect the harmony of the celestial spheres, embodied this philosophy. The most surprising adherents to these ideas were the very figures we now hail as the fathers of modern science. For them, there was no contradiction between empirical investigation and hermetic mysticism. They were two sides of the same coin. The astronomer Johannes Kepler sought the musical harmony of the spheres in the motions of the planets. The physician Paracelsus revolutionized medicine by applying the hermetic principle of correspondence, using astrological knowledge to diagnose illness and seeking alchemical processes to create new medicines. Most famously, Isaac Newton, the arch-rationalist who gave us the laws of motion and universal gravitude, was deeply immersed in hermetic thought. He spent more time studying and writing about alchemy and the prophecies in the book of Daniel than he did on physics. For Newton, the mathematical order he discovered in the universe was not impersonal mechanism. It was the tangible expression of a divine, intelligent mind. His quest to uncover a single, unifying force behind all phenomena, a precursor to the modern search for a theory of everything, was a fundamentally hermetic endeavor. To these Renaissance minds, to study the world was to study the mind of God, and to perform an experiment was to participate in a divine alchemy. So why did this holistic, all-encompassing system, which had inspired so much genius, fall into disrepute and abandonment? The decline of Hermeticism was not due to a failure of its ideas, but a fundamental shift in the intellectual climate of Europe, often called the Scientific Revolution. A new generation of thinkers, led by figures like René Descartes and Francis Bacon, began to advocate for a new methodology. Descartes' famous dictum, "I think, therefore I am," severed the mind from the body and the observer from the observed world. Bacon argued that nature must be put on the rack and tortured for her secrets through rigorous experimentation. This new philosophy demanded a strict separation between the subjective and the objective. The mystical, the symbolic, and the spiritual had no place in this new vision of science. Knowledge had to be purely empirical, measurable, and repeatable. The rich, complex, and often ambiguous world of Hermeticism, with its talk of cosmic sympathy and spiritual rebirth, was increasingly dismissed as occult, which literally means hidden, and therefore unscientific superstition. The very things that made it so powerful, its holism, its focus on inner experience, its spiritual dimension, became liabilities in an age that prized reductionism, external measurement, and materialistic explanations above all else. The baby of intuitive, interconnected knowledge was thrown out with the bathwater of superstition, yet the ghost of Hermes never truly left the building of science. Historians of science have increasingly noted that the Hermetic impulse, the drive to find a unified theory of reality, remains the engine of the greatest scientific pursuits. And in a fascinating twist, some of the most startling discoveries of 20th century physics have begun to sound strangely familiar to students of ancient wisdom. The Hermetic principle, as above, so below, finds a curious echo in the world of quantum physics, where the behavior of the smallest subatomic particles seems to be mysteriously connected to the act of observation by a conscious mind. The holistic view of the universe as an inseparable, interconnected whole is a central tenet of quantum entanglement, which Einstein himself famously called spooky action at a distance. The old alchemical idea of the unity of all matter is realized in the fact that every atom in our bodies was forged in the heart of a long-dead star, making us literally, physically, one with the cosmos. While no serious physicist would claim to be practicing Hermeticism, the parallels are provocative. They suggest that the abandonment of this knowledge system may have been a necessary phase, a clearing of the deck to establish a firm foundation of empirical fact, but not a final verdict on its underlying principles. The story of Hermeticism is a powerful lesson in the pendulum swing of intellectual history, revealing that even the most abandoned systems can leave an indelible imprint on the world, waiting centuries for a new age to recognize the value of the wisdom they tried to preserve. While the great libraries of the ancient world had crumbled and the vibrant intellectual networks of the Islamic Golden Age faced new pressures, a different kind of knowledge sanctuary was taking root across the landscapes of medieval Europe. In the quiet, cloistered halls of monasteries, far from the political turmoil and violence of the outside world, a monumental project of cultural rescue was underway. These religious communities became the unexpected guardians of the fading classical world, dedicating countless hours to the painstaking, sacred labor of copying texts by hand. The rooms where this work took place, called Scriptoria, were hushed factories of preservation, where the soft scratch of a quill on parchment was the sound of civilization itself being given a fragile second chance. Here, in these isolated outposts, monks served as human photocopiers, their meticulous hands ensuring that the works of Plato, Aristotle, Virgil, and Cicero would not vanish entirely from human memory. This was not a project driven by academic curiosity, but by religious duty. The act of copying was seen as a form of prayer, a meditation on the divine word. Yet, for all the devotion poured into this work, the process of preservation was also a process of selection, and the choices made in these silent scriptoria would forever shape the intellectual inheritance of the West, saving a precious fraction of the past while inadvertently condemning the rest to oblivion. The physical act of creating a single book in the early Middle Ages was an arduous, years-long endeavor that required a small army of specialized labor. It began with the parchment maker, who would prepare the animal skins, typically calf, sheep, or goat, through a grueling process of soaking, stretching, scraping, and drying. The scribe or copyist would then rule the prepared sheets with faint lines to keep his writing straight and even. Seated at a sloping desk for hours on end, he would work by natural light, dipping his quill, usually made from a goose or swan feather, into ink crafted from oak gall, gum arabic, and water. The script itself was a masterpiece of consistency and discipline. A single mistake could mean days of work scraped away with a knife or painted over. After the text was complete, the illuminator would step in, adding breathtaking flourishes of color and gold leaf for initial capitals and illustrations, transforming the manuscript into a work of art as well as a vessel of knowledge. Finally, the binder would gather the sheets, sew them into quires, and encase them in sturdy wooden boards often covered with leather and fitted with metal clasps. The result was an object of immense value and durability, a treasure that represented an enormous investment of time, skill, and scarce resources. Each book was a small fortress of knowledge, built to withstand the ages, but the very labor intensity of its creation meant that only a select few texts could ever hope to be saved. This brings us to the most consequential filter through which ancient knowledge had to pass, the criteria for selection. What was worth saving? For the monastic communities, the answer was inevitably shaped by their faith and their mission. The highest priority was given, understandably, to sacred texts, Bibles, psalters, liturgical works, and the writings of the Church Fathers like Augustine and Jerome. These were copied again and again, ensuring their survival above all else. Next came texts that could be usefully absorbed into a Christian worldview. The philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, for instance, could be adapted to support theological arguments about the soul and the nature of God. But vast swaths of classical literature failed to pass this test. Pagan religious texts held little interest. Historical works that celebrated the glory of Rome or the exploits of pre-Christian heroes were often seen as morally suspect or simply irrelevant. Perhaps the greatest loss was in the realm of poetry and drama. We know from references and fragments that the ancient Greek world produced a staggering volume of plays. The Athenian tragedians Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides each wrote over 70 plays. Today, we have just 7 each from Aeschylus and Sophocles and 19 from Euripides. The rest are simply gone, their papyrus originals decayed, and their copies never made by the monks whose primary concern was the salvation of souls, not the preservation of pagan theatre. Historians estimate that less than 1% of all classical Latin literature survived the winnowing process of the Middle Ages, and the figure for Greek works is even smaller. The fragility of this entire system was brutally exposed by external threats, proving that even these fortified repositories of knowledge were not invulnerable. The Scriptorium of the Benedictine monastery at Monte Cassino in Italy, founded by Saint Benedict himself in the 6th century, was one of the most important in Europe. Its library grew to be a magnificent storehouse of classical and early Christian texts. But in the year 883, the monastery was ruthlessly sacked by Saracen raiders. The monks were slaughtered, and the entire library was put to the torch, its priceless manuscripts reduced to ash. This was a catastrophic, single-point failure that erased untold numbers of unique works forever. Centuries later, a different kind of threat emerged not from foreign invaders, but from within the Christian world itself. The Protestant Reformation and the subsequent English Reformation under King Henry VIII unleashed a wave of iconoclasm and institutional dismantling. Henry's dissolution of the monasteries between 1536 and 1541 was a land grab and a power play, but its cultural consequences were devastating. Monastic libraries across England were ransacked. Precious books were stripped for their valuable bindings, their parchment pages scraped clean and reused for accounting ledgers, or even used as stuffing for furniture and as kindling. The dispersed collections were scattered and lost, a coordinated system of preservation systematically dismantled in a few short years. This history of both salvation and staggering loss forces a deeply sobering reflection. Our entire understanding of the classical world is built upon the thin, fragmented shelf of works that made it through the multiple bottlenecks of time, selection, and violence. We possess the plays of Sophocles that a handful of medieval monks, for their own reasons, decided were worth the immense effort of copying. But what of the plays they didn't choose? What masterpieces of literature, what revolutionary scientific theories, what alternative philosophies have vanished because they didn't align with the theological priorities of the era's primary archivists? The monastic scriptoria stand as a powerful paradox. They were both the saviors and the unwitting censors of the ancient world. Their legacy teaches us a crucial lesson about preservation. It is never neutral. The decision of what to save is itself a form of editing history, a powerful act that shapes the future's perception of the past. As we now embark on our own vast project of digital preservation, storing unimaginable amounts of information in the cloud, we must ask ourselves what our own criteria for selection are. What are we choosing to save, and what are we allowing to disappear into digital decay? Are we, like the medieval monks, prioritizing the convenient and the orthodox, while the eccentric, the controversial, and the complex slip through the cracks of our new digital scriptoria? The quiet dedication of those long-ago scribes saved a world, but the gaps they left behind are a permanent reminder that the transmission of knowledge is always a story of what survives and a haunting elegy for all that does not. But long before the quiet hum of the monastic scriptorium, and even before the first marks were pressed into wet clay, humanity had already perfected a different, far more ancient and intimate technology for preserving knowledge, the human voice itself. For tens of thousands of years across every inhabited continent, the primary library of human experience was not built of stone or parchment, but of memory, rhythm, and story. This was the world of oral tradition, a vast and sophisticated knowledge system that wove together history, law, ecology, and spirituality into a living tapestry, passed directly from one generation to the next through song, poetry, and spoken word. Unlike a static text on a page, an oral tradition is a performance, a dynamic and evolving act of communal remembering that engages not just the mind, but the body, the heart, and the soul of both the speaker and the listener. It is knowledge that is felt, not just understood. To grasp the sheer scale and precision of these systems, we can journey to the vast deserts of Australia, where Aboriginal cultures developed one of the most remarkable cartographic traditions ever conceived, the songlines. A songline is far more than a simple melody. It is a sung map of the entire continent, an intricate musical narrative that describes the paths and actions of ancestral creator beings during the dreamtime. As these ancestral beings moved across the land, their journeys formed every mountain, every river, every waterhole. The songs that tell these stories are therefore a precise geographical and navigational guide. A skilled elder, knowing the song for a particular route, can travel hundreds of miles across featureless desert by recalling the sequence of landmarks described in the verse. The song for a journey from a particular rock formation to a specific gum tree might be 50 verses long, each verse encoding the turning of a corner or the sighting of a distant hill. This is a library where the books are sung, the shelves are the landscape itself, and the librarians are the keepers of the song. It is a holistic system where geography, mythology, and law are inseparable, ensuring that to know the song is to know the land and your responsibility to care for it. On another continent, in the cultures of West Africa, a different but equally vital oral tradition was maintained by a specialized class of historians and musicians known as griots. A griot or jelly was more than a storyteller. They were living archives, walking repositories of their people's entire historical record. They memorized genealogies that stretched back centuries, ensuring that lineage and inheritance rights were perfectly remembered. They preserved the epic histories of kings and battles, the details of peace treaties and migrations, all set to music using instruments like the kora, a beautiful 21-string harp lute. The training to become a griot was a lifetime's work, often passed down within specific families. A single griot epic, like that of Sundiata Keita, the founder of the Mali Empire, can take over 3 days to perform in its entirety. The Belgian anthropologist Jan van Sina, who pioneered the study of oral history as a legitimate academic discipline, spent decades working in Central Africa. He demonstrated that these traditions were not mere folktales. They were rigorously maintained and could preserve accurate historical information across hundreds of years through structured mechanisms of peer review, where multiple custodians would cross-check each other's recitations for accuracy, ensuring the core narrative remained intact even as the performance itself might adapt to contexts. The strengths of this oral mode of transmission are profound and unique. Because it is living, it is inherently adaptable. A written law code is fixed, but a spoken history can be subtly refined with each generation, incorporating new lessons or contextualizing ancient wisdom for contemporary problems. It is also deeply democratic and community-oriented. Knowledge is not locked away in a building accessible only to an elite class of scribes or priests. It is shared in the communal space around a fire where everyone from the youngest child to the oldest elder can listen, participate, and internalize the shared identity of their culture. Most importantly, oral traditions carry a dimension of knowledge that writing often flattens out. Embodied knowledge. A Hawaiian chant or oli is not just a recitation of words, it is a physical and spiritual practice. The correct pronunciation, the specific cadence, the very feeling of the vibration in the chest, these are all essential to its meaning and its power. This is knowledge that cannot be fully captured on a page. It must be breathed and felt. It connects the knower to the knowledge in a way that is visceral and immediate. Yet, for all their resilience over millennia, these robust systems have proven heartbreakingly vulnerable to the pressures of the modern world. The very orality that is their strength also makes them exquisitely fragile. The connection is a single generation thick. If that chain is broken, if the elders die before they can pass the songs to the youth, the knowledge is gone forever. This is the crisis that has unfolded in the wake of colonization, forced assimilation, and globalization. In Hawaii, the arrival of American missionaries in the 19th century led to the banning of the Hawaiian language and the suppression of native cultural practices, including the chanting of the Kumulipo, a creation epic thousands of lines long. For decades, these chants were driven underground, and the intricate language needed to understand them was nearly lost across North America, U.S. Government policies that forced Native American children into residential schools, where they were punished for speaking their own languages, severed the chain of transmission for countless stories, songs, and ecological knowledge systems that had been perfected over centuries. The loss is not merely a matter of historical curiosity. It is the erosion of entire worldviews and practical survival guides. When a language dies, a unique way of seeing and interacting with the world dies with it. The unique perspective offered by oral traditions is their holistic nature. A written botanical guide might describe a plant's physical attributes and medicinal uses. An oral tradition, however, might embed that same knowledge within a story that also explains the plant's spiritual significance, the ceremony for harvesting it that ensures sustainability, the song that is sung to it as a sign of respect, and the time of year when its potency is greatest according to the cycles of the moon. This is a complete system of understanding that integrates the practical with the ethical and the spiritual. To lose the oral tradition is not just to forget a fact, it is to collapse that entire integrated structure, leaving behind a shell of information stripped of its context and its soul. The great effort now underway by communities worldwide to revive these traditions through language immersion schools, digital recording projects, and intergenerational workshops is not an attempt to live in the past. It is a vital race to reforge broken links in the chain of human knowledge, to recover ways of being in the world that offer profound insights into sustainability, community, and our place in the intricate web of life. For thousands of years, the art of healing was not a singular path but a rich tapestry of diverse traditions, each offering a unique window into the intricate relationship between the human body and the wider world. Long before the advent of pharmaceuticals and randomized controlled trials, ancient physicians were developing sophisticated medical systems based on careful observation, philosophical principles, and generations of accumulated wisdom. In India, the system of Ayurveda, or the science of life, framed health as a delicate balance between three fundamental energies or doshas: Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. This was not a simplistic theory. It was a complex understanding of an individual's unique constitution, where illness was seen as a state of imbalance that could be corrected through personalized regimens of diet, herbal remedies, yoga, and meditation. At the same time, in China, the practice of traditional Chinese medicine was mapping the flow of a vital life force, Qi, through a network of meridians in the body. Health was harmony and disease was blockage or stagnation, addressed by restoring flow through techniques like acupuncture, herbal formulas, and exercises like Tai Chi. Meanwhile, in Europe, the teachings of the Greek physician Galen, based on the earlier work of Hippocrates, dominated medical thought for over a millennium. His theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, suggested that personality and physical health were determined by their balance, and treatments from bloodletting to dietary changes aimed to restore that equilibrium. What unites these seemingly disparate systems is a profoundly holistic worldview that stands in stark contrast to the reductionist approach that would later come to dominate. They did not view the body as a mere machine composed of separate, interchangeable parts. Instead, they saw a human being as an indivisible whole, deeply interconnected with their environment, their diet, their emotional state, and even the seasons. An Ayurvedic physician would not just treat a fever, they would seek to understand the patient's entire lifestyle, the quality of their digestion, and their mental temperament to address the root cause of the Pitta imbalance. A traditional Chinese medicine doctor would see a skin condition not as an isolated dermatological issue, but as a sign of a deeper imbalance in an internal organ system, perhaps the lungs or large intestine. This preventative, big-picture perspective meant that maintaining health was an active, daily practice of living in alignment with natural law, not just a frantic response to crisis. As modern experts like Dr. Mimi Guarneri, founder of the Academy of Integrative Health and Medicine, argue, the abandonment of these holistic models led to a critical narrowing of medical focus. Western medicine, in its triumphant rise, became spectacularly effective at acute care and fighting specific pathogens, but it often did so by focusing almost exclusively on symptomatology, suppressing the symptom, while paying less attention to the underlying terrain of the patient's health and the powerful tools of prevention. This historical shift from holistic care to a more mechanistic model was not driven by a lack of efficacy in the older systems, but largely by cultural and political dominance. The global expansion of European colonial powers and the subsequent rise of the scientific method created a new standard for what constituted valid knowledge. Systems based on empirical, measurable, and repeatable laboratory results were elevated, while those rooted in philosophy, energy, and qualitative experience were dismissed as unscientific superstition. The publication of the Flexner Report in 1910 in the United States was a pivotal moment that formally standardized medical education around this new scientific model, leading to the closure of many schools teaching eclectic or holistic practices and cementing the dominance of a pharmaceutical and surgery-based approach. The incredible life-saving power of this new medicine, antibiotics, vaccines, and advanced surgical techniques rightfully earned its place, but its victory was so complete that it cast a long shadow, obscuring the value of the older, more nuanced systems it replaced. Yet, in a fascinating turn of events, the 21st century is witnessing a powerful resurgence of interest in these abandoned medical paths. The very practices that were once marginalized are now being validated by modern science and sought out by patients seeking more comprehensive care. Acupuncture, a cornerstone of traditional Chinese medicine once viewed with deep skepticism in the West, is now recommended by the World Health Organization for over 100 conditions, and neuroimaging studies show it can trigger measurable changes in brain chemistry and blood flow. The herbal pharmacopoeias of both Ayurveda and TCM are now fertile ground for pharmaceutical research, with scientists isolating active compounds from plants like turmeric and artemisia to develop new drugs. The core principles of these ancient systems, personalized treatment, the mind-body connection, and the importance of lifestyle and prevention, are now the foundational pillars of the rapidly growing field of integrative medicine. This isn't a rejection of modern science, but a synthesis, an attempt to create a more complete healthcare model that marries the technological brilliance of Western medicine with the timeless wisdom of the ancients. This journey through the history of medicine forces us to confront a vital question. What if the greatest medical breakthrough of our time is not a new drug or a new device, but a new paradigm, one that humbly reintegrates the abandoned knowledge of the past? What could our healthcare system look like if it truly valued prevention as much as intervention? If it treated patients as unique individuals rather than collections of symptoms? And if it viewed the body not as a battlefield to be conquered, but as a garden to be nurtured? The story of these abandoned medical systems is a profound lesson in the cost of cultural amnesia. It shows us that progress does not always mean replacing the old with the new. Sometimes it means having the wisdom to recognize that the past still has crucial truths to teach us, truths about balance, harmony, and the profound interconnectedness of life itself. Yet, even as these ancient healing traditions were being rediscovered, a much earlier and more profound intellectual revolution had already set the stage for their original abandonment, a revolution that would fundamentally redefine the very meaning of knowledge itself. The 18th century in Europe saw the dawn of the Enlightenment, an age that proudly declared itself the Age of Reason. This was a cultural and philosophical movement that championed empiricism, skepticism, and the power of the human intellect to understand the universe through observation and logic. It was a necessary and powerful reaction against the authoritarian dogma of the Church and the superstitions that had often held sway, and it unleashed an unprecedented wave of scientific and political progress that shaped the modern world. But this great leap forward came with a profound and often unacknowledged cost. In its zeal to establish a new, rational order, the Enlightenment consciously and systematically marginalized vast realms of knowledge that did not fit its new, narrow criteria for truth. The rich, complex, and holistic systems of esoteric thought, alchemy, astrology, natural magic, and hermeticism, which had been the cutting edge of intellectual inquiry for centuries, were now dismissed as childish superstition, forcibly ejected from the halls of academia and relegated to the dusty attic of history. To understand the magnitude of this shift, we need only look at a figure like John Dee, the brilliant Elizabethan mathematician, astronomer, and advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. Today, Dee is often remembered as a shadowy magician and occultist, but this is a caricature created by the Enlightenment's later prejudice. In his own time, Dee was a true Renaissance man, a respected scientific mind whose work seamlessly blended the emerging empirical methods with a deep engagement with the esoteric. His immense library at Mortlake was one of the largest in Europe, a center of learning that contained volumes on Euclidean geometry alongside encrypted texts on angelic communication. For Dee, there was no contradiction. He saw the exploration of the natural world through mathematics and the exploration of the spiritual world through symbolic language as two complementary paths to the same divine truth. He applied his formidable mathematical mind to navigation and cartography, helping to advance England's age of exploration, while simultaneously seeking to understand the hidden, angelic language of creation. His work represented the last flourishing of a world view where the objective and the subjective, the measurable and the mystical, were still part of a single, grand endeavor to comprehend a living, enchanted universe. This unified vision was precisely what the new philosophers of the Enlightenment sought to dismantle. Thinkers like René Descartes in France and Francis Bacon in England became the architects of a new epistemology. Descartes' famous declaration, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, did more than just establish a foundation for knowledge. It created a radical split between the thinking mind and the physical world, a doctrine known as Cartesian dualism. The res extensa, the extended world of matter, was to be studied as a mechanical system, a great clockwork governed by mathematical laws. The res cogitans, the world of mind and spirit, was relegated to the private realm of religion and philosophy. Bacon, meanwhile, advocated for putting nature on the rack to torture her secrets from her, promoting a methodology that was powerful but also inherently adversarial and extractive. This new philosophy demanded a purge of anything that smacked of the subjective, the symbolic, or the unmeasurable. The complex, allegorical language of alchemy, which saw spiritual transformation in chemical processes, was reduced to a foolish quest for gold. The intricate astrological charts, which mapped correlations between celestial and terrestrial events, were dismissed as primitive fortune-telling. The rich tapestry of correspondences that saw the human microcosm reflected in the celestial macrocosm was torn apart. Historians of science now recognize that this great divorce, while enabling spectacular technological and medical advances, also created a deep and enduring dichotomy in our understanding of reality. It cleaved the world into two separate spheres: objective knowledge, which was considered valid, real, and progressive, and subjective knowledge, which was deemed personal, unreliable, and ultimately unimportant. This valorization of the purely objective is what allowed the physical sciences to advance at a breathtaking pace, but it also left us with a disenchanted world, a universe stripped of intrinsic meaning and purpose. The cosmos became a cold, mechanical void, and humanity was reduced to a lonely, conscious observer trapped inside a skull, looking out at a universe that was ultimately silent and indifferent. The holistic vision of a John Dee, where a single experiment could reveal both a physical property and a spiritual truth, became not just obsolete, but literally unthinkable within the new paradigm. The reasons for this abandonment were as much sociological as they were philosophical. The emerging scientific institutions, like the Royal Society in London, were acutely aware that to gain credibility and funding, they had to sharply distinguish themselves from the superstitious past. Alchemy and astrology were associated with the charlatanism of mountebanks and the declining influence of the Church, which had itself often persecuted genuine scientific inquiry. To legitimize their new project, the pioneers of modern science had to create a clear, clean break, and that meant ejecting their own intellectual predecessors. The baby of intuitive, interconnected wisdom was thrown out with the bathwater of superstition. The result was a more focused and powerful form of inquiry, but one that was also narrower, more specialized, and increasingly unable to address questions of meaning, value, and purpose. This historical pivot forces a compelling question for our own time. The contemporary explosion of interest in mindfulness, spirituality, and holistic wellness, from yoga and meditation to the revival of tarot and astrology as tools for psychological insight, can be seen as a widespread, cultural yearning to heal this centuries-old rift. It represents a deep, intuitive desire to reclaim the abandoned parts of the human experience, to find a way to reintegrate the subjective and the objective. This isn't a rejection of science, but a search for a more complete picture, one that acknowledges the data of the laboratory and the data of lived experience. The story of the Enlightenment's great abandonment is a powerful lesson in how cultural movements act as editors of reality, deciding not just what we can know, but what we are allowed to consider worth knowing. It shows us that the path of progress is never a straight line, but a series of choices, and that sometimes to move forward, we must also be willing to look back and recover the valuable treasures we left behind on the road. We've journeyed through millennia, witnessing how knowledge can be lost to fire, conquest, and cultural shift. But perhaps the greatest threat to our collective memory is not one of violent destruction, but of silent, creeping obsolescence. We now live in the digital age, a period defined by our ability to create and store more information than every previous generation combined. We have moved the great library of human thought from clay and parchment to servers and silicon, believing we have achieved a permanent victory over forgetting. Yet, this incredible technological leap has introduced a terrifying new paradox. We are producing more knowledge than ever before, while simultaneously building the perfect conditions for its total and irreversible abandonment. The risks we face are not those of flames or invading armies, but of file formats, corporate mergers, and the quiet, relentless decay of magnetic charge on a hard drive platter. The core of this new vulnerability is a problem our ancestors never had to contemplate: format obsolescence. Imagine a historian in the year 2100 trying to access a collection of 21st century documents. They might find a perfectly preserved floppy disk from the 1990s, but without the specific hardware to read its 3.5-inch magnetic surface, and without the proprietary software to decode the now abandoned word processor file format stored on it, that disk is nothing more than a plastic coaster. The data is physically there, but it is locked behind a series of technological gates that have long since crumbled. This is not a hypothetical scenario, it is happening right now. Vast archives of early digital art, pioneering video games, and crucial government records from the 1980s and 90s are already teetering on the brink of oblivion. The software they depend on no longer runs on modern operating systems, and the machines built to read the physical media are themselves aging relics, their parts no longer manufactured. This rapid churn of technological generations means that a storage format can go from cutting edge to completely unreadable within a single human lifetime, a pace of change that makes long-term preservation a frantic and often losing race against time. This challenge is compounded by the phenomenon of data decay, or what archivists call bit rot. Unlike a clay tablet that can survive for thousands of years in a dry cave, digital data is incredibly fragile. The magnetic fields on a hard drive weaken over time. Optical discs like CDs and DVDs are susceptible to physical degradation, their reflective layers oxidizing and becoming unreadable. Solid-state drives have a finite number of read-write cycles before their memory cells wear out. And all of this is before considering the threat of accidental deletion, corruption, or catastrophic hardware failure. Digital information is not a stable inscription. It is a pattern that must be constantly monitored, refreshed, and migrated to new platforms to survive. Without this active and ongoing maintenance, our digital legacy is not permanent, it is ephemeral, more like a message written in fog than one carved in stone. This has led prominent digital archivists to issue a stark warning that without a concerted, global effort, our era may be remembered not for its information explosion, but for a digital dark age, a period where future generations look back at the late 20th and early 21st centuries and find a vast and inexplicable gap in the historical record, a silence where our voices should be. In the face of this daunting challenge, heroic efforts are underway to stem the tide. Non-profit organizations like the Internet Archive have declared it their mission to prevent this digital amnesia. Acting as a modern-day Library of Alexandria for the web, they employ automated crawlers that constantly scour the Internet, taking snapshots of websites and storing them in a universal format for posterity. Their Wayback Machine allows anyone to travel back in time to see what a website looked like on a specific day, preserving not just the information itself but the context and culture of the early web. Similar initiatives are dedicated to preserving vintage software and video games through emulation, creating software that mimics the behavior of obsolete hardware, effectively building a digital version of the key needed to unlock those old files. These projects are monumental in scope and deeply noble in intent, but they operate in a perpetual state of crisis management, always trying to catch up with the accelerating pace of technological change, often relying on donations and volunteer effort to do the work that arguably should be a global priority. This brings us to a profound and unsettling ethical dilemma at the heart of our digital existence: the privatization of knowledge. An ever-increasing amount of our collective cultural output, our personal photos, our creative work, our communications resides on the servers of private corporations like Google, Facebook, and Amazon. Our modern knowledge system is not a public library, it is a collection of privately leased spaces. This creates an enormous vulnerability. When a company goes out of business or decides a service is no longer profitable, that knowledge can simply vanish. The shutdown of platforms like Yahoo GeoCities, the music service MySpace, which lost over 12 years of user-uploaded music in a server migration accident, or even the more recent demise of Google+, serve as stark reminders that corporate interests and the long-term preservation of human knowledge are not always aligned. We have entrusted our collective memory to entities whose primary responsibility is to their shareholders, not to future generations. This raises critical questions. Who gets to decide what is worth saving? Can a profit-driven company be the faithful custodian of our culture? And what happens to our history when the primary archives are controlled by a handful of powerful, unaccountable private entities? The lessons from our journey through history's abandoned knowledge systems are clear. Centralization is a single point of failure, and preservation requires conscious, dedicated effort. The digital dilemma is not a new story. It is the oldest story of human civilization dressed in new clothes. The solution must be a multi-pronged approach that learns from the past. It requires robust, independent, and publicly funded digital archives. It demands that we develop and adhere to open, non-proprietary file standards that ensure future accessibility. It means embracing the practice of lots of copies, keep stuff safe, decentralizing storage, and distributing copies across multiple institutions and geographical locations. Most importantly, it requires a shift in our own mindset to move from being passive consumers of digital platforms to active stewards of our own digital heritage. We must ask ourselves not just how to create information, but how to ensure it remains alive, accessible, and meaningful for those who will come long after our own servers have been powered down for the last time. Yet, even as we grapple with the silent decay of our digital age, a powerful counter-movement is gaining momentum, one that seeks to heal the very ruptures in human understanding we've been exploring. This is not a story of nostalgic longing for a lost golden age, but a dynamic, interdisciplinary frontier where cutting-edge technology is being deployed to literally resurrect the past, not as a museum exhibit, but as a living library of solutions for our most pressing modern challenges. The narrative of abandonment is being forcefully rewritten into one of rediscovery, as scientists, archaeologists, and historians are joining forces in a grand project of intellectual reconciliation, proving that the wisdom of our ancestors is not a closed book, but a vital source code waiting to be recompiled. One of the most breathtaking tools in this new arsenal is LiDAR, or light detection and ranging. Imagine being able to strip away a dense, centuries-old rainforest canopy with the push of a button, revealing the ghostly footprints of a civilization hidden beneath. This is precisely what LiDAR technology does. Mounted on aircraft, it fires millions of laser pulses at the ground, measuring their return to create a supremely detailed, three-dimensional map of the Earth's surface. In the jungles of Cambodia, LiDAR surveys revealed the true staggering scale of the Khmer Empire, mapping a vast urban landscape around Angkor Wat that was far more extensive and complex than anyone had dreamed, complete with sophisticated water management systems that collapsed due to climate instability, a poignant lesson for our own time. In Mexico, it has peeled back the veil on the Olmec and Maya civilizations, uncovering lost cities, ceremonial centers, and networks of raised causeways that have forced a complete re-evaluation of the population density and political organization of ancient Mesoamerica. This technology is doing more than just finding new ruins. It's allowing us to see the complete human-altered landscape, the ancient fingerprints on the environment that hold clues to how societies thrived, managed their resources, and ultimately why they failed. Beyond mapping entire cities, this spirit of rediscovery is focusing on the very materials our ancestors used, with revolutionary results. For decades, scientists were baffled by the legendary durability of Roman concrete. While our modern concrete structures crumble after decades, Roman piers and breakwaters have withstood the punishing force of the ocean for 2 millennia. The secret, it turns out, was not in a single magical ingredient, but in a sophisticated chemical process. Researchers like Marie Jackson at the University of Utah have discovered that the Romans used a mix of volcanic ash, lime, and seawater. The true genius lies in what happens over time. As seawater percolates through the concrete, it reacts with the volcanic material to form a rare mineral called aluminous tobermorite. This mineral creates crystalline structures that actually strengthen the concrete, filling in microcracks and making it more resilient with age. It is a self-healing material, a technology we are only now beginning to replicate in modern labs. This isn't just a historical curiosity. It has profound implications for modern sustainable construction. By mimicking this ancient recipe, we could create marine structures, seawalls, and even nuclear waste containment facilities that last for centuries, not decades, drastically reducing the carbon footprint and economic cost of constant repair and replacement. This collaborative effort extends into the enigmatic realm of lost languages, where artificial intelligence is now being recruited as a cryptographer. The task of deciphering scripts like Linear or the ancient Indus Valley script has long been a painstaking, human-powered endeavor, often stretching across generations with little progress. Now, computer scientists and linguists are teaming up to create algorithms that can detect patterns far too subtle for the human eye. These AI systems analyze the statistical frequency of symbols, their positions in relation to one another, and compare them to the structures of known languages, generating probabilistic models of what an undeciphered text might contain. While no AI has yet cracked a major script on its own, it is dramatically accelerating the process, allowing researchers to test thousands of hypothetical translations in the time it used to take to test one. It's a powerful partnership. The machine provides the brute force pattern recognition, while the human scholar provides the cultural and historical context to interpret the results. This fusion of silicon and scholarship represents our best hope for finally hearing the voices of civilizations that have been silent for thousands of years. Perhaps the most urgent application of this reclaimed knowledge is in the field of agriculture, where the past is offering a roadmap for a more sustainable future. As industrial monoculture farming faces crises of soil depletion, water scarcity, and pesticide resistance, agronomists are turning back the clock. The Three Sisters planting method of Native American cultures, the symbiotic trio of corn, beans, and squash, is being studied not as a folklore exhibit, but as a sophisticated model of polyculture that naturally fertilizes the soil, suppresses weeds, and produces a nutritionally complete diet without any chemical inputs. Similarly, the ancient Amazonian dark earth, or terra preta, is a man-made, hyper-fertile soil that has retained its nutrients for centuries. Scientists are now reverse engineering its composition, a mix of charcoal, bone, and manure to create modern, biochar soil amendments that can sequester carbon from the atmosphere while dramatically improving agricultural yield, a potential game changer in the fight against climate change and global hunger. This is the ultimate validation of traditional knowledge. It's not merely old, it's advanced, refined by millennia of iterative experimentation in living laboratories. Underpinning all these efforts is a profound and necessary shift in perspective, a humility that acknowledges the limitations of our own technological arrogance. Dr. Vandana Shiva, a physicist and environmental activist, powerfully articulates this when she states, "Traditional knowledge is not primitive. It is the refined, sophisticated product of centuries of adaptation and innovation." This work requires us to step down from the assumption that newer always means better, and to accept that past civilizations possessed insights born of deep, sustained observation that our own rapid, industrialized pace of life has often overlooked. The project of rediscovery is therefore an act of intellectual justice, a rebalancing of the historical scales that for too long dismissed non-Western or pre-modern knowledge as inferior. It is a collaborative dialogue across time, where a Mayan water management technique can inform a modern city's response to drought, and a Roman concrete formula can inspire a new generation of green materials science. This is the hopeful coda to our long story of loss, that abandonment is not always a permanent state. The embers of ancient wisdom never truly went cold. They were merely waiting for a new generation, equipped with new tools and a new sense of humility, to breathe them back into flame. But this incredible power to reclaim and reinterpret the past comes with a profound and inescapable ethical weight. As we reach back through time to gather these abandoned threads of wisdom, we must pause and ask a crucial, guiding question. Who exactly gets to decide what knowledge is worth saving and on what terms? The act of preservation is never neutral. It is a deeply political and ethical act, shaped by the same power dynamics and cultural biases that led to the abandonment of these systems in the first place. For centuries, the curation of history has been dominated by Western academic institutions, museums, and collectors, who often operated under a colonial mindset that treated indigenous knowledge and sacred artifacts as curiosities to be extracted, studied, and displayed, rather than as living traditions belonging to sovereign communities. This approach, however well-intentioned, frequently crossed the line into cultural appropriation, where elements of a culture are taken out of context, stripped of their meaning, and used for profit or prestige by those outside the culture, without permission, reciprocity, or respect. We see this tension play out vividly in the ongoing, and often contentious, movement for the repatriation of cultural artifacts. For decades, institutions like the British Museum have defended their retention of objects like the Benin bronzes or the Parthenon marbles under the guise of preservation and universal access, arguing that they are safeguarding these treasures for all of humanity. But this perspective ignores the violence of their acquisition and the ongoing harm of their absence. For the communities from which these objects were taken, often through war, theft, or unequal negotiation. Their loss is not just about a missing artwork. It is a severing of a living link to their ancestors, their spirituality, and their cultural identity. A sacred mask in a sterile museum case, labeled with a colonial inventory number, is a prisoner of knowledge, its context and power muted. The growing and increasingly successful push for repatriation, led courageously by indigenous communities themselves, is a powerful correction to this historical injustice. It is a demand for the return of not just objects, but of sovereignty, of the right to control one's own narrative and to steward one's own heritage. This shift from appropriation to collaboration is the new ethical frontier of knowledge preservation. True, respectful rediscovery now means stepping back and allowing communities to lead. It means moving from being extractive researchers to being humble listeners and partners. Across the globe, from the Maori in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to the First Nations of Canada, communities are spearheading digital projects to preserve their languages, creating virtual museums to showcase their treasures on their own terms, and reviving traditional practices like native seed keeping and sustainable fishing. The role of outside institutions in these efforts is not to direct but to support, providing resources, technical expertise, and platforms, while fundamentally respecting indigenous data sovereignty, the principle that a community has the right to govern how their information is collected, owned, and used. This requires a foundation of free, prior, and informed consent, a formal process of permission that is continuous and collaborative, not a one-time signature on a form. It acknowledges that some knowledge is sacred, not secret, and that its value lies in its correct use within a specific cultural context, not in its publication in an academic journal for global consumption. This raises one of the most delicate ethical dilemmas, the commercialization of sacred knowledge. When a corporation patents a gene from a plant used for centuries in traditional Amazonian medicine, or when a wellness brand mass markets a simplified, decontextualized version of a Native American spiritual ceremony, they are engaging in a modern form of extraction. They are profiting from a system of knowledge while offering nothing back to the culture that sustained and developed it, and in the process, they often distort and cheapen its meaning. Ethicists argue that the preservation of knowledge must be inclusive and equitable, actively working to dismantle the biases that have historically privileged certain ways of knowing, typically written, Western, and scientific over others that are oral, indigenous, and experiential. The goal is not to create a hierarchy of knowledge, but a mosaic, where each system is valued for its unique insights and contributions to our collective understanding of the world. As we stand at this crossroads, we are forced to confront our responsibility not just to the past, but to the future. The choices we make today about what to save, how to save it, and who gets to decide will shape the intellectual inheritance of generations to come. What will we leave in the digital record for our descendants? Will it be a diverse and inclusive library of human thought? Or will it be a curated collection that reflects our own narrow biases and commercial interests? The act of preservation is an act of love for the future, a message in a bottle tossed into the stream of time. We must ensure that the message we send is one of respect, collaboration, and humility, a testament to the breathtaking diversity of human ingenuity and a promise that we have learned from the tragic abandonments of the past, vowing never to let the light of knowledge be extinguished again simply because we failed to recognize its value or respect its source. And so our journey through the echoes of forgotten genius brings us to a final, humbling realization. We have wandered through the ashes of Alexandria, stood before the silent, undeciphered script of the Minoans, and marveled at the intricate gears of the Antikythera Mechanism, a device that feels like a message in a bottle from a timeline we somehow left behind. This is not merely a tour of history's curiosities. It is a profound lesson in the fragile architecture of human progress. The story of civilization, it turns out, is not a straight, ascending line, but a series of soaring peaks and deep valleys, of brilliant light followed by long, chilling shadows. These abandoned knowledge systems reveal a fundamental truth: innovation is not inevitable. It is a delicate flame that must be constantly tended, fiercely protected, and widely shared, lest it be extinguished by the winds of war, the slow creep of cultural amnesia, or the simple, tragic passage of time. The patterns we have witnessed are as clear as they are sobering. Time and again, the greatest threats to knowledge are not a lack of intelligence, but an excess of human frailty. External forces, the sack of a city, the collapse of an empire, the devastation of a pandemic, can shatter the institutions that house our collective wisdom in a terrifyingly short span. But perhaps even more insidious are the internal shifts, the cultural decisions we make about what is valuable. The Enlightenment's rejection of the mystical in favor of the purely empirical, the colonialist dismissal of indigenous science as primitive superstition, the modern prioritization of the new over the old, these are all choices that have narrowed our field of vision, causing us to abandon entire landscapes of understanding. We have seen that knowledge is most vulnerable when it is too centralized, too secretive, or too tied to a single, fragile medium, whether that medium is a parchment codex, an oral tradition, or a soon-to-be obsolete digital file format. Yet within this narrative of loss lies a powerful and urgent hope, the act of rediscovery. This is not an exercise in nostalgia, it is a vital, forward-looking endeavor. The brilliant work of modern scientists reverse engineering the self-healing properties of Roman concrete, or of linguists employing artificial intelligence to finally hear the whispers of linear A, proves that the past is not a closed book. It is a living, breathing library of solutions. The sustainable agricultural practices of the Maya, the holistic medical frameworks of Ayurveda, the celestial navigation skills of the Swahili sailors, these are not relics. They are reservoirs of practical wisdom, offering us alternative paths forward as we confront the immense challenges of climate change, resource scarcity, and social disconnection. To reclaim these abandoned systems is to enrich our toolkit for survival and to acknowledge that our ancestors were not primitive. They were pioneers who saw the world through a different and often deeply insightful lens. This brings us to our collective responsibility. The lesson from the Library of Alexandria is that we must never again store the world's wisdom in a single, vulnerable repository. The lesson from the lost languages and oral traditions is that we must value and protect diverse ways of knowing, not just those that fit neatly into a Western scientific paradigm. Our preservation efforts must be as multifaceted as humanity itself, safeguarding knowledge in physical, digital, and most importantly, living cultural forms. It requires a commitment to collaboration over appropriation, ensuring that indigenous communities lead the way in revitalizing their own heritage. As we build our own digital legacy, we must do so with an eye toward eternity, championing open formats and decentralized archives to ensure that our own era does not become the next great silence in the human story. The astronomer Carl Sagan once offered a warning that resonates with chilling precision in the context of our exploration. He said, "We have also arranged things so that almost no one understands science and technology." This is a prescription for disaster. His words cut to the heart of the matter. When knowledge becomes the exclusive domain of a specialized elite, when the public is alienated from the workings of its own world, we recreate the conditions that have led to abandonment again and again. We build a society that is fragile, one that risks losing its own operating manual. The antidote is to foster a culture of broad understanding, of curiosity, and of reverence for the vast and interconnected tapestry of human ingenuity. So we turn the question over to you. Which of these abandoned knowledge systems captured your imagination the most? Does the mystery of the Voynich Manuscript fire your curiosity, or does the practical genius of Inca engineering inspire you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We are truly eager to hear which threads of this vast human story you find most compelling. If you have enjoyed this journey into the forgotten corners of history, please subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the world's greatest mysteries. Together, let's ensure that the great library of human achievement continues to grow, its shelves expanding with the light of rediscovered wisdom, so that never again will we have to mourn for a golden age we were too